Anarchism. Anarchism is more than a rejection of authority. It's a defiant scream from the soul, a yearning for a world without chains, without masters, without cages disguised as laws. At its core, anarchism is the belief that no individual or group has the inherent right to rule over others. It's not chaos, it's clarity, a clarity that pierces through the illusion that governments, borders, and hierarchies are natural or necessary. Anarchists see the world not as it is, but as it could be, raw, decentralized, free. From the moment we're born, we're fed systems. Obey your parents, listen to your teachers, respect the police, follow the law. Anarchism asks the dangerous question, why? Why should power reside in the hands of a few? Why should the rich dictate the lives of the poor? Why should freedom be rationed, licensed, taxed? What makes anarchism electrifying and terrifying is its unapologetic trust in human potential. It believes people can organize, cooperate, and coexist without coercion. It sees mutual aid, voluntary association, and horizontal decision-making not as utopian dreams, but as radical necessities. It is a philosophy that thrives in protest, in barricades, in solidarity marches, in community gardens grown in concrete jungles. Anarchism burns brightest in moments of resistance, when students rise against censorship, when workers take over their factories, when the voiceless reclaim their voice. It is the heartbeat of revolution, the art of saying no when the world demands submission. And while the state calls it criminal and society calls it naive, to those who feel the weight of unjust power pressing on their chest, anarchism feels like breathing for the first time. Communism. Communism is not just a political ideology, it is a cry for dignity from the depths of oppression. It is the defiance of centuries where the many toiled so the few could feast. At its heart, communism declares that the wealth of the world belongs to those who create it, not to those who hoard it. It is the dream of a classless society where money no longer rules, where labor is no longer exploited, and where each person gives according to their ability and receives according to their need. Born from the ashes of industrial misery and sharpened by revolutions soaked in blood and hope, communism exposes the brutality hidden behind polished capitalism. It peels away the lies that hard work alone leads to success and reveals a system rigged to keep the powerful at the top, always consuming, always controlling. It sees landlords profiting while tenants starve, CEOs hoarding while workers struggle, and it roars with one undeniable truth. This is not justice. Communism is fire. It spreads when the hunger gets louder than fear, when people realize they are not alone in their suffering. It manifests in collective action, in striking hands and rising voices, in the fearless belief that people deserve more than survival. They deserve joy, rest, purpose. It finds power in unity, in the broken forging bonds of solidarity, and in the idea that liberation is not a dream for tomorrow, but a right long overdue. To the privileged, communism is a threat. To the exploited, it is salvation wrapped in rebellion. It doesn't whisper reform, it demands revolution. It doesn't beg for scraps, it demands the table be flipped. And once the illusion of fairness is shattered, once you see the machinery grinding human lives into profit, there's no unseeing it. Communism becomes not a theory, but a moral imperative. Socialism. Socialism is the aching belief that no one should suffer while others thrive, that the measure of a society is not how high the wealth climbs, but how low it lets its people fall. It is the fierce insistence that healthcare is not a privilege, education is not a commodity, and human dignity is not something to be earned through profit. At its core, socialism is about reclaiming what has been stolen, the power of the many, stripped away by the greed of the few, It is born in the cries of mothers choosing between rent and food, in the exhaustion of workers whose sweat builds empires they will never touch. It rises in the face of a system that says poverty is a personal failure while billionaires are called visionaries. Socialism sees through this lie. It understands that inequality is not an accident. It is engineered, and it dares to demand something better. This ideology is not about handouts. It is about justice. It is about a world where no child sleeps on concrete while mansions sit empty, where no one dies for lack of insulin while pharmaceutical companies drown in profit. It is about placing value on people, not portfolios. Socialism believes in public ownership, in collective responsibility, in solidarity over competition, in lifting each other up instead of climbing over one another to reach the top. What makes socialism burn in the hearts of millions is its audacity to care in a world trained to look away. It speaks for the silenced, for the unseen, for the working hands that keep everything running. In every protest, every union meeting, every food bank run by volunteers, socialism is alive, a force that refuses to accept cruelty as the cost of doing business. Marxism. Marxism is not just a theory. It's a lens that rips the mask off society and reveals the raw machinery of power grinding beneath. It is the unrelenting voice that whispers what we're told never to question, that the world we live in is not fair, not neutral, not inevitable. At its core, Marxism is the analysis of class struggle, the idea that history moves through the clash between oppressors and the oppressed, between those who own and those who labor, between capital and the working class. It teaches that capitalism is not freedom, it's exploitation in disguise, that the factory worker, the teacher, the nurse, the delivery driver, they create value, and yet the fruits of their labor are siphoned upward, turned into yachts and stock buybacks for a class that does nothing but own. Marxism pulls back the curtain on this theft and names it for what it is: alienation. You produce, but the product isn't yours. Your time is consumed, your energy drained, your spirit commodified, and in return, you're told to be grateful for a paycheck that barely sustains you. Marxism is rage refined into clarity. It gives language to what so many feel but can't articulate, that something is deeply wrong, that the deck is stacked, that no matter how hard you work, the game is rigged. But it doesn't stop at critique. It offers revolution. It offers a vision where workers control the means of production, where profit is no longer God, and where history is not something suffered, but something shaped. It doesn't beg the powerful to be kinder. It doesn't ask for scraps. It calls for upheaval, for the dismantling of every structure built on exploitation. And once that truth ignites inside you, it's not something you can put out. It becomes your compass, your fire. Leninism. Leninism is the sharpened edge of revolution, cold, unyielding, and forged in the fire of historical betrayal. It emerges not just from Marxist theory, but from the brutal realization that power never concedes willingly. At its core, Leninism is the conviction that the working class cannot simply wait for capitalism to collapse. It must be organized, it must be led, and it must seize the state with disciplined, relentless force. It is revolution with a spine, with strategy, with teeth. Where Marxism diagnosed the sickness, Leninism prescribes the knife. It declares that the state is not a neutral playground, it is a weapon, and whoever holds it defines the world. Lenin saw that the capitalist class would never surrender through debate or moral appeal. They would crush opposition with violence, law, and propaganda. So he built a blueprint for resistance, the vanguard party. Not a crowd, not a mob, but a tightly organized, ideologically armed force prepared to dismantle the machinery of exploitation. Leninism is not soft, it is not polite. It is born of a world where asking nicely leads to starvation, where reform is camouflage for delay, and where compromise is a coffin. It believes in the dictatorship of the proletariat, not as tyranny, but as a necessary stage to dismantle centuries of bourgeois rule. It knows that after the revolution, the old elite will fight to return, and that only a strong, centralized authority can defend the fragile birth of a new world. This ideology does not romanticize rebellion. It demands discipline, sacrifice, focus, and for those who feel the unbearable weight of systemic cruelty, Leninism offers not just hope, it offers a weapon, a plan, a way forward through fire. Stalinism. Stalinism is the iron fist beneath the banner of revolution, the moment when dreams of liberation are hardened into absolute control. It is named not for theory, but for the man who forged ideology into a weapon, Joseph Stalin. Stalinism is the embodiment of centralized power taken to its final, brutal extreme. It speaks in commands, marches in silence, and bleeds through history as a warning written in the ink of fear and obedience. Born in the chaos after Lenin, Stalinism emerged with promises of unity and progress. But beneath the surface, it reshaped communism into a rigid system of state terror, forced industrialization, and absolute loyalty. Dissent became treason. Questioning became suicide. The collective was everything, the individual, nothing. Farms were seized, cities reshaped, enemies imagined and erased. Millions perished in purges, gulags, and engineered famines, sacrificed at the altar of a state that demanded worship disguised as patriotism. Yet even through the horror, Stalinism seduced. It built factories from ashes, raised steel cities from soil, sent rockets into the void. It made a shattered country a global superpower, and that power, terrifying and magnetic, drew both awe and dread. For some, Stalinism symbolized strength, a nation rising unbowed. For others, it was a prison in the shape of a country. The terrifying truth of Stalinism is how seductive order can be when chaos reigns, how easy it is to surrender freedom for the promise of stability, and how ideology, twisted by ambition and fear, can turn utopia into a machine that grinds human spirit into dust, all while calling it progress. Maoism. Maoism is revolution with blistered hands and dirt beneath the nails, a doctrine born not in factories but in the fields, where the forgotten masses till soil under the weight of dynasties and dictators. It is the ferocious belief that power does not trickle from cities or parliaments, but rises from the peasantry, from the silent millions long dismissed as irrelevant. Maoism does not wait for history to unfold. It grabs it by the throat and drags it through the countryside with fury and purpose. At its heart, Maoism is the weaponization of the rural poor against an entrenched elite. It insists that change must be torn from the ground up, that revolution must be permanent, mobile, alive. It sees class struggle not as a moment, but as a rhythm, a continuous battle where the enemies of the people are not just capitalists, but the seeds of corruption that grow within revolution itself. This is why Maoism does not trust comfort. It does not trust bureaucracy. It trusts movement, struggle, purge. Maoism turns the gun toward the sky and teaches that political power flows from its barrel. It teaches that the revolutionary spirit must be renewed constantly, not with speeches, but with upheaval. This is why it births cultural revolutions, why it demands thought be not just transformed, but purified. It aims not only to break the old world, but to annihilate the mindset that allowed it to thrive. To those suffocating under imperialism, colonialism, and poverty, Maoism doesn't offer reform. It offers a detonator, a path soaked in risk and sacrifice, but also in agency. It demands everything. And for those who have nothing, that cost is worth paying. Because in Maoism, even the most forgotten soul becomes a soldier of history. Trotskyism. Trotskyism is the fire that refused to be extinguished, the unbroken voice of revolution exiled, betrayed, and hunted, but never silenced. It is the legacy of Leon Trotsky, the sharp mind behind the Russian Revolution's early surge and the relentless critic of Stalin's suffocating grip. Where others settled into power, Trotskyism kept dreaming, kept fighting for a world where socialism would not rot from within. At its core, Trotskyism is rebellion against betrayal. It believes that socialism must be international, or it will die. It rejects the idea of building socialism in one isolated nation while the rest of the world is still chained to capitalism. Trotsky saw the rot spreading early, bureaucracy rising, voices disappearing, truth replaced by fear, and he named it. He named Stalin's regime a betrayal of everything the revolution had promised. For that, he was branded a traitor, erased from history books, and eventually murdered with an ice axe in exile. But his vision didn't die. Trotskyism lives wherever people refuse to let revolutions be buried in compromise. It lives in those who fight not just for a change of rulers, but for the end of all oppression. It warns that revolutions can be stolen, and that without democracy from below, even the left can become tyranny in disguise. Trotskyism is raw, electric defiance. It is the cry of those who saw their comrades crushed and still raised the red banner. It is theory sharpened by exile, conviction tempered by loss. It is a ghost that haunts the powerful, not just with what was, but with what could have been. Anarchocommunism. Anarchocommunism is the wild heartbeat of rebellion fused with compassion, a vision of a world without masters, without prisons, without profit, and without permission. It doesn't just reject the state, it dreams of a society where domination in all forms, economic, political, and personal, is torn out at the root. At its core, anarcho-communism is the belief that people can live freely, without coercion, in a world where all property is held in common and all decisions are made together, without rulers, without bosses, without fear. It sees capitalism as a cage, and the state as its guard. It sees money as a tool of separation, and hierarchies as viruses infecting the soul of humanity. But it doesn't just want to burn these systems to the ground. It wants to build something breathtaking in their place, something where food, shelter, and love are not luxuries to be earned, but rights that flow freely to all. Something where the individual can flourish not in isolation, but in solidarity, not above others, but beside them. Anarcho-communism thrives in the cracks, community kitchens feeding strangers without asking for a cent, mutual aid networks delivering medicine during collapse, squats transformed into sanctuaries. It breathes in collective creation, in direct action, in resistance that heals as it fights. And it demands that liberation be total, not just political, not just economic, but emotional and spiritual. To those crushed by bureaucracy and commodification, anarcho-communism doesn't sound like chaos. It sounds like breathing, like finally being allowed to exist without begging for permission. It is not utopia. It is urgency. It is not peace. It is revolt reborn as care. And once it touches you, no other freedom feels real. Libertarian Socialism. Libertarian Socialism is a heartbeat against domination in all its forms, a furious, radiant demand for freedom and equality side by side, never one without the other. It rebels not only against capitalism, but against the state itself, refusing to trade one master for another. It whispers through the barricades and booms in assembly halls. True liberation cannot be handed down from above. It must be built from the ground up, by free people organizing their own lives. At its core, libertarian socialism is trust. Trust in people, in communities, in solidarity born not from coercion, but from shared purpose. It refuses to believe that power must flow from thrones, boardrooms, or bureaucracies. Instead, it sees liberation in workers' councils, in horizontal assemblies, in neighborhoods where decisions are made face to face, with no bosses, no rulers, no elite behind the curtain pulling strings. It is a rejection of the brutal lie that hierarchy is natural. It sees capitalism as theft of time, of labor, of joy, and the state as its enforcer. But it does not replace one tyranny with another. It does not worship state socialism or bow to party doctrine. Libertarian socialism fights for a world where cooperation replaces competition, where mutual aid replaces profit, and where power is always shared, never hoarded. It burns in the streets of rebellion, in the courage of collectives, in the quiet defiance of those who build something better, in the shadow of systems designed to crush them. It is radical and romantic, practical and uncompromising. It dares to dream of a world without masters, not someday, but now. And once you taste that vision, you can never go back. Democratic socialism. Democratic socialism is the voice that says you shouldn't have to bleed to afford a hospital visit. It's the stubborn belief that freedom isn't real when your rent devours half your paycheck and your vote can't compete with a billionaire's wallet. At its core, democratic socialism demands that democracy doesn't end at the ballot box. It must reach into the workplace, the economy, the healthcare system, the schools, the streets. It refuses to separate liberty from livelihood, insisting that both must belong to everyone. It envisions a society where the levers of power are not gripped by corporations or shadowy elites, but held by the people, openly, transparently, and equally. It does not seek to replace democracy with revolution. It seeks to deepen it, to make it real, to make it tangible in daily life. Because what good is the right to vote if your child goes hungry? What is the point of freedom of speech if you can't afford to keep the lights on? Democratic socialism burns with the idea that government should protect, not punish, that the economy should serve people, not the other way around. It dreams of a world where health care is a human right, where education opens doors instead of chaining you in debt, where workers have a voice that roars louder than profits. It's not about state control, it's about public power, about reclaiming systems from the grip of the greedy and returning them to the hands of the many. In a world suffocated by inequality and corporate dominance, democratic socialism doesn't whisper compromise. It screams justice. It's hope with teeth, compassion with structure. And for those who have been told their suffering is inevitable, it offers a quiet revolution made not with guns, but with ballots, solidarity, and unstoppable will. Social democracy. Social democracy is the compromise carved in struggle, the belief that capitalism can be tamed, that justice can live within the system, that you don't have to burn it all down to build something more humane. It is the answer forged by those who looked into the eyes of suffering and said, "We can fix this without revolution." It is neither surrender nor uprising, but a tightrope walked between greed and compassion. At its core, social democracy insists that the market must serve people, not rule them. It acknowledges the power of capitalism to create wealth, but demands that this wealth be shared, taxed, and used to uplift. It carves out sanctuaries, universal health care, free education, living wages, worker protections, within an economy that would otherwise devour the vulnerable. It builds safety nets from the threads of human dignity and weaves fairness into the machinery of a profit-driven world. But what makes social democracy powerful is its refusal to abandon hope, even in the heart of the system. It doesn't fantasize about utopia, it fights for the possible. It turns ballots into barricades, policy into protest, legislation into lifelines. It is compromise, but it is a fierce compromise, born not of weakness, but of compassion sharpened into strategy. Critics call it naive. Idealists call it not enough. But to the single mother who gets health care, to the factory worker whose union saved his job, to the student who can afford college without debt, it is everything. Social democracy does not promise paradise. It promises a fight worth having, and sometimes that fight looks like a vote, a protest, a strike. Sometimes it just looks like giving people a chance to breathe. Utopian Socialism. Utopian socialism is the raw, aching dream of a world unscarred by greed, a vision born not from strategy, but from the deep emotional certainty that humanity can be better. It is not a blueprint drawn in blood, but a hope written in stars, imagining societies free from hunger, cruelty, and division. At its core, utopian socialism believes in the transformative power of kindness, cooperation, and moral awakening. It dares to imagine a future where competition dissolves into community and no one is left behind. It was born before Marx, before manifestos, in the minds of visionaries who saw the pain of industrialization, the soot-stained children, the endless grind of labor, the wealthy few towering over the broken many, and said, "This is not the only way." They did not organize armies or write revolutions. They built model communities. They drew cities powered by equality, by shared labor, by common purpose. They believed that if people were simply shown a better way, if they saw justice with their own eyes, they would choose it. Utopian socialism is not naive. It is defiant. It is the refusal to let cynicism win. It does not seek to seize power. It seeks to make power obsolete. It believes love can be scaled, that peace can be structured, that harmony is not a fantasy, but a choice. And even as critics mocked it as impractical, as romantic nonsense, it lit the spark that would guide more radical fires. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is believe in beauty, in a world built not on survival, but on solidarity. In utopian socialism, the revolution isn't violent, it's radiant. It begins with imagination and ends with no one left in the dark. Syndicalism. Syndicalism is the rage of the worker forged into a weapon, the belief that the factory floor, the rail yard, the classroom, the hospital are the true centers of power, and that those who labor must be the ones to lead. It rejects the cold distance of politicians and the suffocating grip of bosses. It sees no salvation in parliaments or presidents. Instead, it looks to the strike, to the union, to the clenched fist of workers rising in solidarity, ready to shut down the system that feeds on their sweat. At its core, syndicalism is direct action. Not petitions, not negotiations. Action. When the machines stop, when the trains halt, when the lights go dark, that is when the ruling class listens. Syndicalism believes in seizing that power not through revolution waged in distant capitals, but through collective strength where the work is done. It imagines a world where workers own and manage everything they build, where every workplace becomes a council, every industry a federation, and the economy runs not on exploitation, but on cooperation. What makes syndicalism burn hot is its raw, unfiltered defiance. It is not polite. It does not ask. It takes. It takes the tools of production, the means of distribution, the structures of labor, and places them into the calloused hands of those who keep the world moving. It dreams of a general strike so vast it becomes a transformation. There is no middle ground in syndicalism. Either you control your labor, or someone else does. Either you rise with your comrades, or you are broken alone. It is solidarity turned into strategy, sacrifice, courage, and resistance marching as one. Council Communism. Council Communism is the clenched fist of the worker, not raised in obedience to a party, but in defiance of every structure that speaks for them without listening. It is communism stripped of hierarchy, of dogma, of distant leaders making decisions in marble halls. At its core, council communism declares that real power must rise from the shop floor, from the assembly, from the people themselves, organized not by decree, but by collective will. It is revolution that flows from the ground, not from the top. Born in the chaos of failed revolutions and betrayed uprisings, council communism is the furious response to the realization that even people's states can become prisons. It saw the worker-led revolts in Germany, Hungary, and Russia, and how quickly they were crushed, not just by capitalists, but by so-called revolutionaries who replaced kings with commissars. Council communism is the howl of betrayal turned into a demand. No one speaks for us but us. Its lifeblood is the Workers' Council, a direct, democratic body where laborers plan, vote, and govern their own affairs. No bosses, no vanguards, just people, organizing their lives without being ruled. It rejects the state as inherently oppressive, even when painted red. It rejects party control as a new kind of leash and instead trusts in the intelligence and courage of ordinary people to shape their world together. Council communism is not soft rebellion. It is fierce, organized autonomy. It is what revolution looks like when it refuses to become tyranny, and in a world where every voice is drowned by hierarchy and every promise of liberation becomes a command, it offers something rare and electric, true self-rule owned by all, dictated by none. Mutualism. Mutualism is the quiet revolution, the soft-spoken but unshakable belief that people can live freely, fairly, and without force. It stands at the crossroads between individual liberty and collective harmony, whispering that we don't need kings or corporations, states or syndicates, to build a just world. At its core, mutualism is trust. Trust in people to cooperate, to exchange, to support one another without domination. It is an economy without exploitation, a society without subjugation. Born from the mind of Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, the first to ever call himself an anarchist, mutualism asks one haunting question: what if property wasn't theft, but neither was it sacred? What if ownership meant possession through use, not endless accumulation? It envisions a world where people own what they work, trade what they make, and share what they can, without landlords, bosses, or parasitic elites siphoning the life out of labor. Mutualism breathes in the spaces where people barter, lend without interest, build cooperatives, and grow food not for profit, but for each other. It is not chaos, it is balance. It is credit unions over banks, worker co-ops over corporations, neighborhoods over bureaucracies. It believes in markets, but not the kind that crush, in currency, but not the kind that enslaves. It believes that freedom and equity do not have to be at odds. They can be bound together by voluntary exchange and reciprocal aid. There is a gentle fire in mutualism, a refusal to exploit, and a demand not to be exploited. It doesn't call for conquest, it calls for connection, and in a world addicted to domination, that refusal is nothing short of revolutionary. Classical liberalism. Classical liberalism is the thunderous cry of the individual breaking free from the chains of monarchy, dogma, and tyranny. It is the fire that lit the minds of revolutionaries and philosophers who dared to say that every human being has inalienable rights, not granted by kings or gods, but born from their very existence. At its core, classical liberalism is the belief that liberty is sacred, that government must serve the people, not rule them, and that reason, not force, must guide society. It rose during a time when speaking freely could cost you your life, when religion dictated laws, and power was inherited rather than earned. Against that backdrop, classical liberalism did something radical. It trusted the individual. It trusted in self-determination, in free markets, in private property, in the belief that people could govern themselves without needing a sword at their throat. Classical liberalism treasures the invisible architecture of freedom, constitutions, civil rights, free speech, and rule of law. It sees the state not as a parent or a savior, but as a necessary servant, bound tightly, limited sharply, restrained from overreach. Because it knows the dangers of concentrated power, it remembers the torture chambers, the censored presses, the burned books, and it swears never to go back. But classical liberalism also asks for responsibility. It believes freedom only flourishes when individuals think critically, act ethically, and resist both tyranny and apathy. It doesn't offer comfort, it offers agency. And in a world still gripped by authoritarianism and blind conformity, classical liberalism remains a fierce and urgent defense of the soul's right to speak, to choose, to live uninterrupted. Modern liberalism. Modern liberalism is the belief that the state can be a shield, that government, when shaped by empathy and reason, can protect the individual not just from tyranny, but from poverty, ignorance, and despair. It is the conviction that freedom is meaningless without opportunity, and that rights on paper are empty unless backed by real access to healthcare, education, housing, and justice. It doesn't trust unchecked markets, nor does it long for revolution. It finds its faith in reform, in policy, in progress stitched step by step into the fabric of daily life. This ideology is born from the wounds of the 20th century, forged in the aftermath of depression, war, and inequality. It watched unfettered capitalism collapse into misery and answered with regulation. It saw fascism rise and responded with civil rights, public programs, and safety nets. Where classical liberalism said, "Leave people alone," modern liberalism says, "Lift them up," because no one is truly free while they are drowning. Modern liberalism fights not with fists, but with laws. It champions the social contract, believing that a civilized society is measured by how it treats its most vulnerable. It wants to tax the rich, not destroy them, empower labor, not dissolve the market, expand access, not abolish structure. But beneath its policies is something deeper, a moral plea for decency in a world that often rewards cruelty. Its critics call it naive or soft, but in its core is a quiet, unwavering courage, the belief that compassion can govern, that fairness can be systematized, and that even in the shadows of injustice, policy can be an instrument of light. Neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is the smooth-talking salesman of modern power, polished, technical, and devastating. It wraps itself in the language of freedom and efficiency, but beneath the graphs and policies lies a brutal creed that the market knows best, and everything, even human life, must bow to its logic. At its core, neoliberalism is the belief that government should step back, corporations should step in, and that competition is not just economic, it is moral. If you're poor, it's your fault. If you suffer, it's because you failed to compete. It rose from the ashes of crisis, sold as salvation. In the late 20th century, as economies faltered and fear spread, neoliberalism entered like a cure. Slash regulations, privatize everything, cut taxes for the rich so wealth would trickle down, replace safety nets with razor wire. It promised prosperity, but delivered precarity. It turned education into debt, healthcare into profit, housing into speculation, and labor into disposable units measured by productivity charts. Neoliberalism doesn't shout, it whispers. It doesn't seize power through violence. It seduces through policy. It reshapes society quietly, turning public goods into assets, turning citizens into consumers, turning solidarity into competition. It teaches us to view each other not as neighbors, but as rivals. It colonizes the mind. so we internalize its cruelty and call it normal. It is why billionaires grow richer during recessions. It is why hospitals advertise like tech startups. It is why your value is measured in output, not in being. And though it wears the mask of progress, underneath lies an old hunger, greed refined into doctrine. For those paying attention, neoliberalism isn't just policy, it's the invisible cage around our lives, tightening while we're told it's freedom. Conservatism. Conservatism is the instinct to hold on, to protect what has stood the test of time, to defend the familiar against the storm of change. It is a heartbeat rooted in tradition, a wary glance at every revolution, a voice that says, before we tear something down, understand why it was built. At its core, conservatism is a reverence for order, for stability, for the invisible threads that bind society together: faith, family, heritage, law. It sees history not as a chain to escape, but as a guide to follow. Conservatism fears the chaos that often masquerades as progress. It watches movements that promise utopia and remembers how easily those dreams can turn into ash. It values restraint over impulse, continuity over disruption. To the conservative mind, freedom is not simply doing what you want. It is the ability to live within a structure that protects, nurtures, and holds people accountable. But conservatism is not passive. It is a defense, often fierce, of identity and culture. It believes that wisdom lives not only in books or theories, but in customs passed from one generation to the next. It sees the family not just as a personal unit, but as a sacred institution. It views the nation not as a contract, but as a living inheritance, something to be preserved, defended, even at great cost. To some, conservatism is comforting. To others, suffocating. But to those who carry it in their bones, it is clarity, a conviction that when the world spins too fast, the answer is not to accelerate, but to anchor. And in an age addicted to tearing down, conservatism chooses to remember, to protect, to stand firm. Neoconservatism. Neoconservatism is the gospel of empire wrapped in the language of liberty. It speaks of freedom, democracy, and moral duty, but always with boots on the ground and fire in the sky. At its core, neoconservatism is the belief that America, or any self-anointed superpower, has not just the right, but the obligation to reshape the world in its own image, through strength, through intervention, through war if necessary. It is idealism forged in steel, diplomacy cloaked in dominance. Born from the disillusionment of former liberals and Cold War hawks, neoconservatism rose with a single conviction: that evil must be confronted, not contained, that totalitarian regimes and rogue states cannot be reasoned with. They must be dismantled. It thrives on the notion of American exceptionalism, the myth that one nation holds the moral compass for the world. And with that myth comes a terrifying power, the authority to decide who is free, who is dangerous, who must be saved, and who must be destroyed. Neoconservatism doesn't wait. It acts, preemptively, militarily. It believes stability is born from shock waves, that toppling dictators brings peace, that unleashing force spreads democracy. But in its wake, it leaves ruins. It left deserts littered with promises, bodies buried under liberation campaigns, entire regions scarred in the name of freedom. To its followers, neoconservatism is duty and destiny. To its critics, it is hubris dressed as heroism. It does not build nations, it invades them. It doesn't question power, it wields it without hesitation. And while it speaks of noble intentions, its legacy whispers something colder, that good intentions, when fused with unchecked force, can burn like fire and justify anything. Paleoconservatism. Paleoconservatism is a growl from the past, a raw, defiant call to return to roots long abandoned in the name of modernity, globalism, and cultural dilution. It is not about polished speeches or corporate-friendly slogans. It is about blood, soil, tradition, and identity. At its core, Paleoconservatism believes in preserving the organic ties that bind a nation, shared history, common ancestry, moral order, and deeply rooted cultural heritage. It does not apologize for placing nation before empire, family before ideology, and virtue before progress. It stands against the homogenizing tide of globalization that flattens language, culture, and meaning into marketable sameness. It rejects the idea that America, or any nation, must become a mall of competing identities or an engine of endless intervention abroad. Paleoconservatism is skeptical of unchecked immigration, cynical of international entanglements, and hostile toward the managerial state that governs without a soul. It craves a republic, not an empire. It seeks community, not bureaucracy. This ideology doesn't hide behind neutrality. It embraces hierarchy, order, and authority as stabilizing forces. It believes tradition is not something to be reinterpreted with each generation, but something sacred, passed down, protected, even fought for. It sees virtue not as a social construct, but as an eternal compass grounded in religion, family, and heritage. To the modern mind, Paleoconservatism can feel like a relic, but to those who feel lost in a world spinning away from meaning, it feels like home. It's not about nostalgia, it's about survival. And beneath its sometimes brutal bluntness lies a deep yearning for permanence in an age of collapse. National conservatism. National conservatism is the pounding of a heart that longs for rootedness in a world spinning too fast. It is the clenched grip on tradition, on sovereignty, on identity, an ideology forged from the fear that something vital is slipping away. At its core, national conservatism believes that a nation is more than borders and laws. It is culture, memory, language, and shared blood. And those things, it claims, must be protected at all costs. It rises in times of confusion, when globalism floods local economies, when liberal cosmopolitanism erodes familiar customs, and when rapid change feels like erasure. National conservatism steps in with a promise. We will preserve what they are trying to erase. It places the nation above all else, above international alliances, above market obsession, above multicultural dreams. It calls for strong borders, strong families, and strong authority rooted in heritage, not theory. This ideology draws strength from a romanticized past, from the idea of a golden age before moral decline, before cultural dilution, before identity became a question mark. It views tradition not as an old costume, but as a compass, spiritual, moral, and civilizational. It champions religion as the soul of the state, family as its backbone, and national pride as its shield. But beneath its warmth lies steel. It does not tolerate ambiguity. It views criticism of the nation as betrayal. It draws lines between citizens and outsiders, between order and chaos, between the real people and the global elite. And while it speaks of unity, it often defines it through exclusion. To those who feel adrift in modernity, national conservatism offers solid ground. But that ground comes guarded, fenced, and fiercely patrolled. Because in its eyes, the future is only worth building if the past is tightly preserved, and if the nation stands, undiluted, above all. Social conservatism. Social conservatism is the fire lit in defense of values, not abstract theories, but deeply held beliefs about right and wrong, family and faith, duty and decency. It is the conviction that society unravels not through war or economics, but through moral decay. When traditions are mocked, when sacred bonds are broken, when virtue is traded for momentary pleasure. At its core, Social conservatism is a moral guardrail built to protect what generations before bled to preserve: marriage, faith, order, and the sanctity of life. It is not indifferent to change, it is terrified by the wrong kind. It watches the world strip away modesty, redefine family, erase gender, and scoff at religion, and it recoils, not because it hates difference, but because it fears what is lost when the anchor of morality is cut loose. To the social conservative, the home is the foundation of civilization, the church its conscience, and tradition its heartbeat. Social conservatism does not believe that all values are equal, nor that morality is subjective. It believes truth exists, absolute, non-negotiable, and often uncomfortable. It sees laws not just as rules, but as reflections of deeper truths. And it rejects the idea that freedom means doing whatever you want. True freedom, it argues, is living within a moral structure that elevates, disciplines, and protects. It is often ridiculed as outdated or repressive, but to those who carry it, it feels like resistance. Resistance against a culture that trades commitment for convenience, reverence for irony, and virtue for validation. In a world sprinting toward reinvention, social conservatism chooses to remember what made us whole and refuses to let it be forgotten. Fiscal conservatism. Fiscal conservatism is the stern voice in the room demanding restraint while others promise more. It is the belief that every dollar spent must be earned, that government should live within its means, and that debt is not just dangerous, it's immoral. At its core, fiscal conservatism sees economic discipline as the foundation of national strength, personal responsibility, and long-term freedom. It is the cold arithmetic behind the emotional chaos of politics, whispering, "You can't spend your way out of a crisis." It rises from a deep suspicion of government overreach, from the fear that bloated bureaucracies and endless spending will erode not only the economy, but the character of a nation. It doesn't trust quick fixes, flashy programs, or populist giveaways. It believes in lean budgets, balanced books, low taxes, and minimal interference, because every expansion of the state, it warns, comes with a price tag too easily ignored and too often deferred to future generations. Fiscal conservatism finds its moral edge in the idea of earned reward. It views prosperity not as a birthright, but as a product of hard work, thrift, and sacrifice. And when the government steps in too much, when it prints, borrows, or spends recklessly, it sees freedom slipping through invisible cracks. Inflation rises, dependency grows, accountability fades, and the soul of a nation, disciplined and industrious, begins to wither. To its defenders, fiscal conservatism is responsibility made policy. To its critics, it is austerity dressed as virtue. But love it or hate it, its message is unwavering. The math always comes due. And if you ignore it long enough, the reckoning won't just be economic, it will be existential. Libertarianism. Libertarianism is the primal scream for freedom, the fierce, uncompromising belief that your life, your body, your choices belong to you and no one else. It is born from a sacred distrust of power in all its forms, whether held by the state, the church, the mob, or the market. At its core, libertarianism demands that coercion be stripped from society, that every human interaction be voluntary, consensual, and free from force. It views the government not as protector, but as predator, an institution that begins with good intentions and ends with prisons, wars, taxes, and surveillance. It sees every law as a question: does this protect liberty or restrict it? Every policy as a litmus test: does this empower the individual or the institution? Libertarianism does not speak in whispers. It shouts, "Live and let live." It finds morality not in imposed codes, but in personal responsibility. You are free to speak, to own, to love, to create, but you must bear the weight of those choices. It does not seek utopia. It seeks autonomy. It sees no justice in redistributing wealth at gunpoint, nor virtue in legislating compassion. It rejects the idea that safety is worth submission, that comfort justifies control. To some, it sounds cold, to others, naive. But to the libertarian heart, it is the only ideology that treats people as sovereign, not subjects. It stands alone against the tide of paternalism and control, insisting that liberty is not a privilege to be granted, but a birthright to be defended, fiercely, unapologetically, and forever. Minarchism. Minarchism is the razor-thin line between freedom and order, an ideology that sees government not as a guiding hand, but as a necessary restraint on chaos and coercion. At its core, Minarchism believes the state should exist solely to protect individual rights, to defend borders, enforce contracts, and uphold the rule of law. Nothing more, nothing less. Everything else, welfare, regulation, subsidies, social engineering, is seen not as service, but as intrusion. It's the rebellion against bloated bureaucracy, against creeping control disguised as care. Minarchists don't hate governance. They fear what it becomes when left unchecked. They see history as a graveyard of governments that started with good intentions and ended in surveillance, taxation, and tyranny. So they carve the role of the state down to its barest bones: police, courts, and military. The rest is for free people to build voluntarily, organically, without coercion. Minarchism pulses with radical trust in the individual. It believes people flourish not when they are managed, but when they are left alone. That the moral responsibility of life, your health, your wealth, your risk, your reward, belongs to you. And when the state steps beyond its bounds, even to help, it corrupts that responsibility, trading liberty for dependence. It is not a naive faith. It is a scarred one. It's born from the wounds of overreach, from watching governments fail with the very power they promised would save. Minarchism doesn't dream of utopia. It demands limits. It says, "Give me protection, and then get out of the way." To some, it sounds harsh. To others, it sounds like breathing. Finally, without permission. Because in Minarchism, freedom isn't granted by the state. It's what remains when the state finally steps back. Objectivism. Objectivism is a declaration of war against self-sacrifice, a philosophy that raises the individual above the collective, that worships reason over faith, and that dares to say the pursuit of your own happiness is the highest moral calling. It is the brainchild of Ayn Rand, forged in rejection of both communism and conformity, a philosophy born in exile and sharpened with steel. At its core, objectivism is radical self-ownership. Your mind is yours, your life is yours, and no one, no state, no church, no crowd has the right to demand you live for them. It sees the world not through the fog of emotion or tradition, but through the clear lens of rational thought. Objectivism believes that reality is objective, truth is knowable, and reason is mankind's only tool for survival. Faith is weakness. Altruism is chains. It tears down the idea that virtue means suffering for others, and instead elevates the hero who builds, thinks, creates, not for the approval of society, but for the joy of achievement itself. Objectivism exalts capitalism not as a compromise, but as a moral ideal, the only system that respects the individual by allowing them to trade value for value, mind for mind, effort for reward. It sees the entrepreneur as a modern Prometheus, punished not for crimes, but for greatness. To critics, it's selfishness disguised as philosophy, but to those who embrace it, objectivism feels like truth stripped of guilt. It's not a whisper of compromise. It's a roar of defiance. You do not owe your life to anyone but yourself, and once that fire is lit, it does not flicker, it burns. Anarcho Capitalism. Anarcho Capitalism is the radical belief that freedom and force cannot coexist, that true liberty demands not just the absence of kings and tyrants, but the abolition of the state itself. At its core, it envisions a society where every interaction is voluntary, every service is competitive, and every inch of life is governed not by coercion, but by consent. It is anarchy, not of chaos, but of markets, of property, of contract, of unshackled choice. It begins with a primal rejection that no man, no institution, no government has the right to take what is yours, not your earnings, not your land, not your autonomy. Anarcho Capitalism sees taxation as theft, regulation as intrusion, and the state as a monopolistic parasite cloaked in the illusion of public good. It replaces state violence with private agreement, bureaucracy with open exchange, and political power with pure ownership. In this vision, roads are built by those who use them, security is hired like any other service, and justice is bought, but not in corruption, in clarity. Competing courts, private arbitration, decentralized protection, all functioning by market principles, not mandates. It trusts that people, left free and armed with property rights, will find better, faster, more moral ways to organize than any centralized regime ever could. Critics scream of inequality, of exploitation, of collapse, but anarcho-capitalists answer with a simple fire. Who protects you now? A state that spies, that taxes, that punishes success and enables decay? Or a system where no one can rule you without your consent? To its believers, anarcho-capitalism is not a fantasy. It is the purest form of liberty, a world where no one owns you, and no one has the right to pretend they do. Ecoanarchism. Ecoanarchism is the howl of the earth breaking through concrete, a fierce, uncompromising fusion of ecological urgency and anarchist rebellion. It is the belief that the destruction of the planet is not just a technological failure or an accident of progress, but the inevitable result of systems built on domination, of nature, of people, of life itself. At its core, eco-anarchism screams that the same forces that chain workers and exploit the poor are the ones poisoning the oceans, torching the forests, and choking the sky. It is not about polite recycling or greenwashed corporate slogans. Eco-anarchism is raw, radical, and rooted in the understanding that the survival of the planet depends on dismantling hierarchies, not tweaking them. It sees capitalism as a death machine, one that values endless growth over balance, profit over life, and convenience over consequence. It rejects the idea that salvation will come from legislation, from billionaires funding climate tech, or from governments that trade ecosystems for votes. Eco-anarchism believes in living with the earth, not on it. It finds hope in degrowth, in self-sustaining communities, in permaculture, in rewilding landscapes and relationships. It draws its power from indigenous wisdom, direct action, and a deep reverence for the interconnectedness of all life. It is sabotage against pipelines. It is tree sits and seed bombs. It is resisting not just environmental destruction, but the mindset that allowed it to flourish. To the eco-anarchist, every chain link of control, economic, political, ecological, is part of the same cage, and the only way out is to burn it down, root and all, and grow something wilder, freer, more sacred in its place. Green politics. Green politics is the voice of the earth, screaming through the cracks in our concrete kingdoms. It is not just about recycling or hugging trees. It is a rebellion against the systems that poison our air, choke our oceans, and treat nature like a warehouse to be emptied. At its core, green politics is a moral uprising. It demands that human progress no longer come at the cost of the planet's survival, and that economic growth never again be measured by destruction. It sees climate change not as a future threat, but a present emergency. Wildfires consuming homes, floods washing away livelihoods, species vanishing like whispers, and beneath it all, a global economy built on extraction, pollution, and denial. Green politics stares into that abyss and chooses a different path, one where sustainability isn't a buzzword, but a lifeline, where we measure success not in GDP, but in clean water, thriving forests, and generations that still have a home to inherit. It is justice, for the earth, yes, but also for the people who suffer first and worst, the poor, the marginalized, the unheard, because environmental collapse doesn't fall equally, it crushes the vulnerable. Green politics knows this, and it fuses ecology with equity, fighting for green jobs, food sovereignty, clean energy, and indigenous rights. It battles not just climate crisis, but capitalism's role in creating it. To the cynical, it's idealism. To the powerful, it's a threat. But to the growing millions who can't breathe without fear, who hear the ice cracking and the forests dying, green politics is not optional. It is survival, a defiant, urgent call to remember that we are not above nature. We are part of it. And if we don't fight for it, we lose everything. Ecosocialism. Ecosocialism is a cry from the burning forests and the flooded streets, a demand that we stop pretending the planet can survive capitalism's hunger. It is the radical marriage of two truths, that ecological collapse is real and accelerating, and that capitalism is its engine. At its core, ecosocialism insists that the climate crisis is not just an environmental issue, it is a justice issue, a class issue, a survival issue. It calls out the lie that green solutions can come from the same system that caused the destruction. Ecosocialism does not believe in carbon credits or green markets or billionaires saving the world with electric cars. It sees through the illusion of sustainable capitalism, because sustainability cannot exist in a system that feeds on endless growth. While CEOs preach climate responsibility from glass towers built on fossil fuels, the poor drown, burn, and starve. Eco-socialism rips off the mask and reveals the horror beneath. A world where the wealthy build bunkers while the rest of us are left to choke on the ashes. But eco-socialism isn't just fury, it is vision. It dreams of a world where energy is shared, not sold, where land is protected, not privatized, where communities manage resources for collective survival, not corporate gain. It believes in public ownership of the environment, not to control it, but to protect it. It sees hope in solidarity, in global cooperation, in dismantling both the oil rigs and the economic empires behind them. To the eco-socialist, the planet is not a commodity. It is a living, breathing inheritance, and the fight to save it is not optional. It is the fight, the final one, and it must be won. Deep ecology. Deep ecology is not a policy, it's a piercing realization. It is the moment you stand in a forest and feel small, not from weakness, but from awe. It is the quiet rage that rises when a river is dammed, when a mountain is torn open, when a species vanishes forever, and no one notices. At its core, deep ecology demands something terrifying and beautiful, the decentering of the human ego. It proclaims that the earth does not exist for us. We are not its masters. We are one strand in its vast, fragile web. Unlike shallow environmentalism, which tweaks systems and chases sustainability through compromise, deep ecology cuts deeper. It declares that the planet is not dying, it is being killed, and the killer is the belief that humans are superior, separate, entitled. It does not want to save nature for our benefit. It wants us to stop treating it like a servant. It calls for a total transformation of consciousness. It asks us to unlearn domination, to step back from consumption, to recognize that a tree has value even if no one profits from its death. It urges biocentric equality, the idea that a beetle, a whale, a glacier, and a child all have intrinsic worth, none above the other, not symbols, not resources, beings, alive. To embrace deep ecology is to grieve deeply, to love wildly, and to live humbly. It means seeing strip mines as scars, skyscrapers as sickness, extinction as a scream. It means rejecting the lie that growth is progress, that convenience is virtue. It is not a comfortable ideology. It is a mirror, and what it reflects is our arrogance. But in that reflection, it also offers redemption. If we choose it, if we remember, we are not gods, just guests, temporary, fragile, and responsible. Fascism. Fascism is the cold march of boots on stone, the brutal, hypnotic promise of order through domination, unity through submission, strength through fear. It is not a theory, but a fever, a dark intoxication that spreads when people are desperate, humiliated, angry. At its core, fascism is the worship of power. It demands loyalty, not reason, identity, not individuality, action, not thought. It thrives on myth, on enemies, on blood-soaked symbols that blur the line between nation and religion, leader and God. Fascism does not argue. It commands. It rises when the world feels broken and offers a scapegoat, a savior, and a simple lie. You are suffering because of them. The outsider, the weak, the different. It feeds on grievance and promises glory. It dresses itself in flags, parades, and the illusion of greatness reborn. But behind the spectacle is cruelty weaponized. It crushes dissent in the name of unity. It destroys truth in the name of loyalty. It exalts the state above the soul, the leader above the law. It calls submission a virtue and paints obedience as patriotism. And when it seizes power, it does not govern. It devours. Books are burned, voices silenced, rights erased. The people don't live, they march. Fascism seduces with strength, but leaves only ruins. It rises fast and dies in fire, but the cost, millions of lives, decades of pain, lives in scars that never fade. And though it disguises itself anew each time it returns, the smell of it is always the same: smoke, blood, and the silence of a world too afraid to speak until it's too late. Nazism. Nazism is hatred-made doctrine, rage weaponized into a political machine. It is the belief that blood determines worth, that the nation is sacred only when purified, and that violence is not the last resort, but a necessary cleansing force. At its core, Nazism is built on the worship of race and the rejection of humanity. It declares some lives superior, others subhuman. It wraps genocide in flags, tyranny in chants, and calls it destiny. It rose from despair, economic ruin, national humiliation, social fracture, and offered not healing, but blame. It pointed fingers at Jews, at communists, at Roma, at the disabled, at anyone who did not fit its twisted image of Aryan perfection. And it did not merely exclude them. It hunted them, systematically, mechanically, without mercy. Nazism made hatred bureaucratic, turning gas chambers and death camps into state policy, turning neighbors into informants, turning cruelty into virtue. It glorified the leader, the Führer, as the embodiment of the Volk. The people fused into one will, one body, one voice. Democracy was weakness. Dissent was treason. Individuality was filth. The state was not a servant of the people. It was a weapon to mold them into obedient instruments of its ideology. Nazism seduced through spectacle, parades, symbols, uniforms, fires lighting up night skies. But beneath the show was rot, the annihilation of truth, of freedom, of decency. It destroyed not just millions of lives, it tried to erase their very memory. To study Nazism is not to explore a political option. It is to stare into a void of human depravity, where fear breeds obedience and hate becomes law. It is a warning, etched in blood, that when power dehumanizes, when lies go unchecked, and when silence replaces resistance, the unthinkable doesn't just happen. It is planned, celebrated, carried out. National Socialism. National Socialism is the ideology of blood and soil twisted into weaponized hate, a toxic fusion of racial supremacy, militant nationalism, and totalitarian control. It is not a misunderstood theory. It is a deliberately engineered machine of dehumanization. Born in post-World War I despair, National Socialism, infamously embodied in Hitler's Nazi regime, offered the German people a seductive lie that their suffering was caused not by war or greed, but by others: the foreigner, the Jew, the Marxist, the degenerate. It turned fear into rage and rage into genocide. At its core, National Socialism exalts the mythical purity of a chosen people, defined not by shared ideals, but by bloodline. It weaponizes identity, demanding racial conformity and cultural obedience under the illusion of national rebirth. It promised strength, unity, revival. What it delivered was tyranny cloaked in flags and propaganda. It built a state not to serve the people, but to mold them, body, mind, and spirit, into tools of the regime. Dissent was treason, diversity was poison. Humanity was reduced to categories, some deemed worthy, others marked for elimination. It glorified violence as virtue, war as destiny. Children were indoctrinated, art, history, language, rewritten to serve a cult of personality and race. And beneath it all, the machinery of death turned ceaselessly. Ghettos, concentration camps, mass graves. It wasn't accidental. It was ideology made flesh. National Socialism didn't just murder millions, it left a stain so deep it became a warning, a scream etched into history, and yet the ideas behind it still whisper in the shadows, reminding us that evil never arrives as a monster. It comes as salvation, as pride, as a promise to make a broken nation whole again, no matter the cost. Monarchism. Monarchism is the ancient heartbeat of order, the belief that a single bloodline, crowned by history or divinity, should stand above the storm of politics. It is the reverence of lineage over legislation, tradition over trend, and the idea that some are born not just to live, but to rule. At its core, monarchism sees the king or queen not as a mere leader, but as the living symbol of a nation's soul. It speaks to a deep human yearning for continuity, for ritual, for something unshaken by the chaos of democracy and the corrosion of modernity. It promises stability in a world spinning too fast. Monarchs don't campaign. They don't pander. They reign. Their power, absolute or ceremonial, is not earned through votes, but inherited like a sacred flame passed through centuries. To monarchists, this is not injustice. It is majesty. It is the belief that sovereignty flows through blood, not ballots, and that the nation thrives best when steered by a figure untouched by petty squabbles and short-term ambition. Monarchism stirs something emotional, even primal. Crowns gleam in our myths, thrones dominate our fairy tales, and coronations carry a gravity that no election ever replicates. It speaks of duty, sacrifice, divine right, and, in its purest form, the monarch is not above the people, but bound to them, destined to serve with solemn grace. But monarchism also carries shadows of tyranny masked in velvet, of peasants crushed beneath gilded boots, of silence forced by decree. Its grandeur can both unify and suffocate, yet to its loyalists, it is not oppression, it is elegance, not nostalgia, but loyalty, because in a monarch's crown, they see not power, but permanence, not politics, but identity, not just a ruler, but a living monument to who they are. Absolute monarchy. Absolute monarchy is rule by blood and divine will, a system where one sovereign holds total, unquestioned power, not by merit or vote, but by birthright. It is the belief that a single person, chosen by fate or God, is destined to embody the state itself. Their word becomes law. Their will shapes the lives of millions. At its core, absolute monarchy is control wrapped in ceremony, elegance masking the raw concentration of power in one throne, one crown, one name. It speaks in silks and swords, in royal decrees and execution orders. The monarch answers to no constitution, no parliament, no court, only to legacy, to lineage, and sometimes to the haunting echo of divine accountability. Their authority is not granted by the people. It descends from heaven or heritage, carved into myth and tradition. Subjects are not citizens. They are children of the crown, bound by duty and fear, often adoring the very figure who rules them. But behind the golden portraits and lavish palaces is a truth harder than stone. One human, flawed, mortal, temperamental, can determine the fate of an entire nation. Wars can be declared on a whim, fortunes lost with a gesture, lives reshaped by the mood of the throne room, and when tyranny wears a crown, resistance becomes treason. To some, absolute monarchy is majesty, stability, continuity, a living symbol of national identity. To others, it is a gilded cage, where freedom is suffocated beneath ceremony and the whims of one. But love it or fear it, absolute monarchy burns with the ancient fire of power concentrated into flesh, a reminder that before ballots and rights, there were crowns, and sometimes all it took to change history was the breath of a king. Constitutional monarchy. Constitutional monarchy is the delicate dance between tradition and modernity, a system where ancient crowns rest beneath the rule of law, and royal bloodlines survive not through power, but through symbolism. At its core, it is the belief that a nation can honor its heritage while embracing democracy, that a monarch can reign without ruling, and that stability can be built on a blend of pageantry and parliament. It offers a strange kind of magic, a head of state who does not govern, but who embodies the nation's story, its ceremonies, its continuity, its soul. The monarch cuts ribbons, reads speeches, opens parliaments, blesses children. But behind the curtain, it is the elected government that writes the laws, sets the budgets, wields the power. And this, to supporters, is the genius of constitutional monarchy. It elevates politics above personality and identity above partisanship. In moments of crisis, the monarch becomes a lighthouse, not to command, but to calm. They do not need to win elections or beg for popularity. They exist outside the political arena, untouched by scandal, unaffected by terms. Their role is unity, silent, stoic, steady. In a world of short attention spans and crumbling institutions, they represent something rare, permanence. But the crown is not weightless. Critics see waste, inequality, pageantry masking privilege. They question the fairness of revering someone simply for being born. And yet, the institution endures, not through fear or force, but through ritual and reverence. Because for many, a constitutional monarchy doesn't just decorate the state, it anchors it. It is the reminder that a nation is not only laws and leaders, but legends. And sometimes, in the chaos of politics, a symbol matters more than a sword. Theocracy. Theocracy is the rule of heaven imposed on earth, a system where laws are written in scripture, where judges wear robes of faith, and where the divine is not worshipped, but enforced. It is the belief that human authority must bow to spiritual command, that morality is not up for debate, and that the highest power is not a king or president, but God, or the men who claim to speak for him. At its core, Theocracy is obedience sanctified, dissent demonized, and control cloaked in holiness. It begins with faith, but it ends in silence. In a theocracy, religion is not personal. It is political. It governs what you wear, what you say, who you love, how you pray. It watches you, not just through surveillance, but through sermons, neighbors, and fear. It claims righteousness, yet wields punishment. It speaks of peace, but enforces purity with courts and whips. The holy book becomes the constitution, and questioning becomes blasphemy. To the devout, theocracy offers clarity, unchanging laws in a chaotic world, a divine structure that transcends human corruption. But beneath that certainty lies danger. When power dresses itself in sanctity, it becomes untouchable. To defy it is not just rebellion, it is sin. And when politics and faith become one, there is no refuge left for the soul. Apostates are hunted, minorities erased, women controlled, science suppressed. Theocracy does not govern. It sanctifies control. It replaces justice with doctrine, liberty with liturgy, and though it speaks of salvation, it often delivers submission. In the name of God, it builds earthly kingdoms that crush those who do not kneel. And in that collision of power and piety, freedom drowns beneath the weight of holiness turned to rule. Technocracy. Technocracy is the cold promise of order over chaos, the belief that society should not be ruled by charisma, popularity, or tradition, but by expertise. At its core, technocracy replaces politicians with engineers, economists, scientists, and data analysts. It trusts not the crowd, but the calculation. It looks at the messiness of democracy, the emotional tides of public opinion, the paralysis of partisanship, and responds with a clean, clinical whisper, "Let the experts decide." It does not care for slogans. It cares for systems. It sees every problem, economic collapse, climate crisis, infrastructure decay, not as ideological battles, but as technical failures that require precision, not passion. In a technocracy, leaders rise not by winning votes, but by proving competence. Degrees replace campaign speeches. Algorithms overrule instinct. Efficiency eclipses ideology. Technocracy finds its soul not in statues or flags, but in flowcharts. It views society like a vast machine, something to be managed, optimized, and repaired by those who understand its parts. And for those sickened by corruption, tribalism, and sensationalism, that sounds like salvation. Why should healthcare be shaped by lobbyists instead of doctors? Why should education policy be dictated by rhetoric instead of research? But there's a chill in that promise, a risk, because when governance is stripped of emotion, who speaks for the human cost? Who fights for justice when efficiency deems it inconvenient? Who decides which data matters and which voices get lost in the numbers? To its believers, technocracy is the triumph of logic over lunacy. To its skeptics, it is a future where power wears a lab coat instead of a crown, but remains just as distant, just as unaccountable. And in that sterile perfection, something vital is always at risk of being left behind, the messy, flawed, irreplaceable heartbeat of humanity. Meritocracy. Meritocracy is the seductive dream that talent will rise, that effort, skill, and intelligence will be the true currency of power. It promises a world where your birth doesn't define your destiny, where titles aren't inherited but earned, where the path to success isn't guarded by bloodlines or connections, but by your own drive and brilliance. At its core, meritocracy whispers a powerful, intoxicating idea. You get what you deserve. It fuels ambition. It turns classrooms into battlegrounds, resumes into weapons, and society into a race that never ends. The promise is pure. Work hard, be smart, and the world will reward you. And when it works, it feels like justice. Those who climb have earned it, and those who fall somehow didn't try hard enough. But beneath that shining surface is a shadow, because meritocracy doesn't start on a level playing field. Some are born into homes of books, tutors, and safety, others into hunger, trauma, and silence. Yet when both are measured by the same standard, failure begins to look like guilt. The poor aren't just struggling, they're seen as undeserving. The system punishes them with shame, not just scarcity. Meritocracy can turn privilege into invisibility, because once success is framed as earned, the privileged no longer need to acknowledge their advantage. And those left behind aren't just forgotten, they're blamed. To believe in meritocracy is to believe in fairness, but to live in it is to witness how quickly fairness becomes a myth. It inspires, it motivates, but it also blinds. And in its blind spot, inequality thrives, hidden beneath the illusion of justice earned. Oligarchy. Oligarchy is power stripped bare, raw, unapologetic, and reserved for the few. It is not interested in freedom, not concerned with justice, not bound by the myth of equality. At its core, oligarchy is ruled by a small elite, whether they wear suits, robes, or uniforms, who bend the system to serve themselves while feeding the masses the illusion of choice. It is not always loud. Often, it whispers behind closed doors, hidden beneath layers of law, wealth, and influence. But its grip is suffocating. It doesn't need violence to control. It uses wealth. It uses media. It uses access. Politicians become puppets. Policies become favors. And the institutions meant to protect the people become shields for the powerful. An oligarchy thrives in silence. It flourishes when people stop asking questions, when outrage turns into exhaustion, and when apathy becomes survival. It wants you distracted, entertained, divided. In oligarchies, elections still happen, but the outcome never truly changes. The candidates may differ, but the donors remain the same. The laws may shift, but the beneficiaries do not. Justice becomes negotiable. Influence becomes currency. And dissent, when it dares to rise, is met not always with violence, but with dismissal, with ridicule, with slow erasure. What makes oligarchy so dangerous is not its visibility, but its normalcy. You get used to the gated communities, the private jets, the quiet immunity. You start to believe that's just how the world works. But beneath every oligarchy lies a suppressed truth, that the many still outnumber the few, that power, once recognized, can still be reclaimed, and that silence, willing or forced, is the only thing that keeps the throne from crumbling. Plutocracy. Plutocracy is rule by the rich, cloaked in the illusion of democracy. It is the quiet empire of wealth, where money doesn't just buy comfort, it buys policy, protection, and power. At its core, plutocracy is the belief, often unspoken but deeply enforced, that those with the most deserve the most. It doesn't wear a crown or wave a flag. It whispers in campaign donations, shapes legislation behind closed doors, and governs through markets instead of mandates. It thrives in silence, in the polite fiction that every citizen has a voice, while billionaires speak in thunder. Laws are written by lobbyists, elections swayed by super PACs, media controlled by conglomerates. It sells the dream of upward mobility while locking the ladders behind paywalls. In a plutocracy, wealth is not just influence, it is immunity. The rich are too big to jail, too connected to fall, too protected to fail. But what makes plutocracy dangerous isn't just that it hoards, it convinces the masses to defend the hoarding. It tells the struggling worker that billionaires are job creators, that taxes are theft, that if they just hustle harder, they too can ascend. It builds a world where wealth becomes virtue and poverty becomes shame. The cruelty of plutocracy is not always loud. It is subtle, systemic, suffocating. It doesn't need violence. It has investment portfolios. It doesn't shout orders. It writes checks. And as the gap between rich and poor becomes a chasm, the very idea of democracy begins to rot. Because when money rules, votes become echoes, and justice becomes something you simply can't afford. Totalitarianism. Totalitarianism is control. Absolute, suffocating, and all-consuming. It is the nightmare where the state does not simply govern your actions, but invades your thoughts, rewrites your memories, and owns your voice. At its core, totalitarianism is the eradication of the individual beneath the boot of a single ideology, a single leader, a single truth. It demands not just obedience, but devotion, not just silence, but praise. It turns a nation into a prison, and every citizen into both prisoner and guard. It does not merely punish resistance, it destroys the very concept of dissent. Books are burned, histories are rewritten, language itself is manipulated until lies become law and truth becomes treason. There are no private spaces, no unsupervised thoughts. Surveillance is constant, propaganda is everywhere. Love for the regime must be performed daily, because fear alone is never enough. It must be blended with illusion. Totalitarianism thrives on fear, but survives on complicity. It doesn't need millions of enforcers, just enough believers and enough people too broken to care. Neighbors turn into informants. Children report on parents. Intimacy is replaced by suspicion. It makes monsters not just of tyrants, but of ordinary people desperate to survive. Its leaders are gods made of mirrors, shining back whatever myth the regime needs. They are eternal, infallible, untouchable. The state becomes the father, the church, the teacher, the judge. There is no higher loyalty, no independent truth, no sanctuary. Even death is not an escape, because under totalitarianism, it's not enough to die. You must first be erased. It does not rule with reason. It rules with terror. And its most terrifying triumph is not when people obey, but when they forget how not to. Authoritarianism. Authoritarianism is control sharpened into a blade, rule not by persuasion or principle, but by command. It is the cold hand over the mouth of a nation, the quiet erasure of freedom wrapped in promises of order and strength. At its core, authoritarianism is the belief that people cannot be trusted with liberty, that society must be tamed, guided, and, if necessary, crushed to achieve stability. It thrives on obedience, not consent, fear, not dialogue, power, not accountability. It begins with a crisis, chaos, insecurity. A leader rises, not always with violence, sometimes with charisma, sometimes with desperation, offering certainty in exchange for surrender. And it works. Slowly, rights are rewritten. Critics disappear. Laws are bent into tools of silence. The press is tamed. The courts fall in line. Elections become rituals, not choices. The people, drained of power, are told they are safer this way. Authoritarianism does not always arrive with tanks. Sometimes it wears a suit. Sometimes it wins applause. It doesn't always punish through guns. It uses policy, propaganda, bureaucracy. It rewires truth until people question their own memories. It trains citizens to police each other until fear lives in every whisper. It builds a society where compliance feels like survival and resistance, suicide. But its cruelty lies not only in what it takes, but in what it convinces people to accept. It replaces complexity with simplicity, freedom with order, uncertainty with unquestionable rule, and slowly the cage becomes invisible, until silence is normal, until fear is instinct, until asking why feels dangerous. Authoritarianism promises peace, but what it delivers is a kingdom of shadows, where power speaks and no one dares to answer back. Populism. Populism is the roar from below, the explosive cry of the forgotten, the overlooked, the betrayed. It is not a left or right ideology. It is a rebellion against elites who hoard power, against systems that smother voices, and against a politics that feels rigged and distant. At its core, populism divides the world into two forces, the pure people and the corrupt elite, and when it speaks, it doesn't whisper through think tanks. It shouts in stadiums, in protests, in ballots scrawled in anger and hope. It thrives in moments of fracture, when economies collapse, when institutions rot, when politicians lie with smiles, and the working class is told to wait, to trust, to be patient. Populism doesn't wait. It doesn't trust. It demands. It channels real pain into a simple, brutal message. They lied to you, and I will fight for you. That message can heal or destroy. Populism is a vessel. In one hand, it can raise justice, championing workers, exposing corruption, toppling oligarchs. In the other, it can hold fire, blaming outsiders, feeding nationalism, inflaming fear. It reflects the soul of the crowd that feeds it, and that crowd is not polite. It's angry, desperate, awake. To its supporters, populism is liberation, the first time anyone really listened. To its critics, it's dangerous, a shortcut around institutions, a gateway to authoritarianism. But whether it builds or breaks depends not on the volume of its voice, but on the heart that drives it. Because populism is not a plan, it is a pulse, and when it beats loud enough, the ground beneath power trembles. Whether it creates justice or chaos depends on what happens after the noise, but the noise always comes first, and it never asks permission. Nationalism. Nationalism is the fire that burns in the chest when a flag is raised. It is pride, identity, belonging, and sometimes a dangerous illusion. At its core, nationalism is the belief that a nation is not just a political unit, but a sacred bond, an extension of blood, culture, language, and destiny. It tells people that they are not alone, that they are part of something greater, older, and worth fighting for. It wraps history in glory, borders in meaning, and belonging in sacrifice. It begins as love for the homeland, for its soil, its symbols, its shared stories, and that love can unify. It can inspire liberation, resistance, survival. It gives people the strength to rebuild after war, to endure occupation, to reclaim stolen dignity. Nationalism makes strangers feel like family. It makes a people rise and say, "This is ours." But nationalism does not stop at pride. It draws lines between us and them, between who belongs and who threatens. And those lines can turn to walls, to laws, to weapons. It turns memory into myth and myth into mandate. The past becomes sacred. The future becomes exclusive. And soon, loyalty is demanded, not just to the nation, but to a version of it that cannot be questioned. It promises unity, but often delivers division. It says you must protect the nation, but sometimes that means silencing dissent, erasing difference, or branding outsiders as enemies. Nationalism is powerful because it taps into something primal, the need to belong. But when that need turns into exclusion, when pride becomes supremacy, the very thing that binds can also blind. And once the anthem swells and the flags wave high, it becomes easy to forget. Love of country is not the same as hatred of others, but nationalism doesn't always remember the difference. Civic nationalism. Civic nationalism is the heartbeat of belonging without blood. It is the belief that a nation is not forged in ancestry, race, or religion, but in shared values, common laws, and a collective commitment to something greater than ourselves. At its core, civic nationalism says, "You are one of us. not because of where you came from, but because of what you believe, what you uphold, what you choose to stand for. It is identity built not on exclusion, but on inclusion through ideals. It rises in defiance of tribalism and fear in moments when society threatens to fracture along ancient lines. It offers an answer that does not divide, but unites, a flag that belongs to all who pledge themselves to the Constitution, to the principles of liberty, justice, and democratic participation. It speaks to immigrants, refugees, the marginalized, the seekers of a new life, and says, "You are not a stranger here. You are home." Civic nationalism is not blind patriotism. It is love with responsibility. It does not ignore a nation's flaws. It confronts them. It calls for citizens to not only enjoy freedom, but to defend it, to engage, to challenge, to vote. It values pluralism, tolerance, and the idea that unity must be chosen, not forced. But even this vision walks a tightrope, because when civic pride curdles into dogma, when values become walls instead of bridges, even the most open nation can close in on itself. Yet in its purest form, civic nationalism is the dream that a nation can be bound not by heritage, but by hope, that strangers can become neighbors, and neighbors can become citizens, not through birth, but through belief. And in a fractured world, that dream is still worth holding. Ethnic nationalism. Ethnic nationalism is identity turned into a boundary, an ideology that ties the soul of a nation not to shared values or civic life, but to blood, ancestry, and unchangeable origin. It is the belief that a nation is defined not by who lives in it, but by who belongs to it, by language, race, lineage, and cultural purity. At its core, ethnic nationalism is the insistence that only a specific people, often bound by centuries of myth and memory, have the right to shape the destiny of a homeland. It whispers to those who feel displaced, erased, or invaded. It thrives in moments of crisis, economic collapse, immigration surges, cultural change, and offers a chilling clarity. You are suffering because you no longer control what is yours. It turns demographic shifts into existential threats. It reframes coexistence as dilution. It sees multiculturalism not as richness, but as rot. Ethnic nationalism does not just seek borders, it seeks purity within them. It builds laws to define citizenship by blood. It recasts history to elevate one group above all others. It measures loyalty in heritage, not in actions. And once the idea takes root, it infects everything. Schools teach only the dominant culture. Media silences the outsider, and political power becomes the right of birth, not belief. To those inside the ethnic fold, it offers pride, protection, belonging. To everyone else, it offers a slow, suffocating exile, socially, economically, or physically. And when it is taken to its extreme, it justifies deportation, oppression, even genocide, all in the name of preserving the nation. Ethnic nationalism doesn't need a gun to start. It begins with a question. Where are you really from? And it ends with a command. Go back. Cultural nationalism. Cultural nationalism is the burning desire to protect the soul of a people, not through bloodlines or borders, but through memory, tradition, language, and myth. It is the fierce belief that a nation is not defined by political lines or legal documents, but by the stories it tells, the songs it sings, the rituals it preserves. At its core, cultural nationalism seeks to shield a collective identity from erosion, dilution, or erasure. It is not always loud, but it is always sacred. It rises when a people feel their essence slipping away under the weight of globalization, colonization, foreign influence, or cultural amnesia. It watches fast food chains replace local cuisine, ancient dialects vanish beneath one global language, and centuries-old customs mocked as primitive. Cultural nationalism is the act of saying, we remember who we are, and we will not forget. It lives in the preservation of indigenous languages, in the defense of traditional dress, in the revival of ancient festivals, in the protection of native arts. It finds power in literature, folklore, ancestral land, and historical memory. For those who've seen their culture pushed aside, rebranded, or commercialized, cultural nationalism is more than pride. It is survival. But its fire can burn both ways. When rooted in respect, it becomes a force of revival and resilience. But when twisted by fear, it can turn into xenophobia, exclusion, and cultural purism, where preserving identity becomes code for rejecting the other. The line between celebration and supremacy becomes dangerously thin. Yet in its purest form, cultural nationalism is not about hate. It's about holding on to the past, to the sacred, to the quiet things that define who we are when no one else is looking. And in a world that demands we forget ourselves, it insists we remember. Religious nationalism. Religious nationalism is the fusion of faith and flag, a fervent conviction that a nation's identity is not only cultural or political, but divinely ordained. At its core, religious nationalism declares that the land belongs to us because God says so, that our laws must reflect our scriptures, and that the soul of the country is bound to a singular religious truth. It is not just belief, it is power claimed in the name of the holy. It begins with pride in faith, in heritage, in divine favor. But quickly, it hardens. The sacred becomes weaponized. The true believer becomes the true citizen, and those of different faiths, or none at all, are no longer just outsiders. They are threats, apostates, corrupters of divine order. Religious nationalism does not seek tolerance, it seeks dominance. It does not protect freedom of religion, it demands conformity to one. This ideology finds momentum in fear. When cultural identity is slipping, when foreign ideas rise, when modern life feels disconnected and soulless, religious nationalism offers clarity, tradition, purpose. It promises a return, not just to God, but to greatness. It wraps sermons in speeches and calls political enemies heretics. And in the name of unity, it crushes diversity. It builds schools that preach dogma, courts that enforce scripture, and governments that see secularism as betrayal. The line between church and state vanishes, and with it, the rights of those who live differently, love differently, or believe differently. To its followers, religious nationalism feels like salvation, but to the nation it controls, it is suffocation dressed in scripture. It prays with one hand and polices with the other, until holiness becomes law, and freedom burns at the altar of identity. Pan-nationalism. Pan-nationalism is a call that echoes across borders, a thunderous belief that scattered peoples, divided by colonial maps or broken histories, are not separate, but one. It is the fire of shared blood, shared language, shared memory rising up to defy the lines drawn by empires and conquerors. At its core, pan-nationalism is the demand for unity across a broader cultural or ethnic identity, a nation not confined by geography, but expanded by belonging. It lives in dreams of reunification, of collective strength, of lost kin returning home. Pan-Arabism, Pan-Africanism, Pan-Slavism, each born from pain, from the splintering of people who once walked under the same sun. It sees the nation not as a cage, but as a living network, millions connected by heritage, history, and hope, waiting to rise together against oppression, occupation, or fragmentation. Pan-nationalism often grows in the shadow of colonization and exile. It remembers how foreign flags divided one people into many, how languages were suppressed, how identities were erased, and it burns with the idea that what was broken can be made whole again, that a united people can reclaim their destiny, their dignity, their voice. But unity is never simple. The wider the embrace, the more complicated the politics. Rivalries emerge, differences surface, and what begins as solidarity can sour into supremacy if driven by conquest instead of cooperation. Yet still, the dream persists. Because pan-nationalism isn't just about lines on a map. It's about finding pieces of yourself in strangers, hearing your ancestors' story spoken in another land, and realizing you were never truly alone. It is the longing to become we again, fiercely, proudly, unapologetically. Globalism. Globalism is the vision of a world without borders, a belief that nations are no longer isolated islands, but threads in a single, interwoven fabric of humanity. It is the idea that economies, cultures, information, and people are meant to move, connect, and collaborate across the old lines of geography and nationalism. At its core, globalism sees the world not as us versus them, but as us with them, a shared planet facing shared challenges, demanding shared solutions. It rises from trade routes and fiber optic cables, from flights crossing time zones and supply chains that span continents. It celebrates interdependence, multiculturalism, and cooperation. It dreams of peace through partnership, progress through openness, and prosperity built not in silos, but in systems. Globalism champions international law, human rights, climate agreements, global institutions, and the belief that what happens in one corner of the world echoes in every other. But beneath its promise lies tension, because globalism doesn't just connect, it disrupts. It can erode local industries, dilute cultural traditions, and leave workers behind as corporations chase the cheapest labor across the globe. It's accused of creating a rootless elite, jet-setting, untethered, loyal to markets, not nations. It is praised for lifting millions from poverty and condemned for deepening inequality. It spreads opportunity and displacement. To some, globalism is hope. To others, it is loss. But either way, it is real. The world is smaller. The systems are linked. And whether through solidarity or struggle, globalism is no longer a choice. It is the air we breathe. The only question left is who benefits from it and who is forgotten in its wake. Anti-globalism. Anti-globalism is the raw, rising scream against a world that feels like it's slipping out of people's hands. It is not just opposition to trade deals or international organizations. It is the rebellion against the feeling of powerlessness, of being ruled by distant forces, invisible markets, and unelected technocrats. At its core, anti-globalism is the fierce demand to take back control of borders, of culture, of identity, of destiny. It sees globalism not as progress, but as erasure. It sees small towns hollowed out by outsourcing, local jobs replaced by automation, traditions drowned in a sea of imported sameness. It sees the working class abandoned while multinational corporations grow fat on tax loopholes and cheap labor. It watches communities fracture while politicians smile at GDP charts and promise that the rising tide will lift all boats, even as some are clearly sinking. Anti-globalism asks a question that cuts deep. Who benefits from this world without borders? Because for every gleaming skyline, there's a shuttered factory. For every corporate merger, there's a lost livelihood. It resents that laws are written in back rooms, that sovereignty is traded like currency, that people are expected to uproot everything for the sake of efficiency. It is not always polite, it is not always pretty, but it is real. A pulse of anger and grief from those who feel betrayed by a system that promised prosperity and delivered precarity. And while some use anti-globalism to stoke fear and scapegoat the vulnerable, others use it to reclaim agency, to protect culture, to fight for self-determination in a world where everything, including identity, is up for sale. It is the backlash of the forgotten, and it will not be quiet. Progressivism. Progressivism is the refusal to accept that this is as good as it gets, the relentless belief that society can, must, and will become more just, more inclusive, more humane. It is a fire that burns against stagnation, a voice that rises wherever systems fail the vulnerable, a force that challenges not only what is wrong, but what is considered normal. At its core, progressivism is rooted in the conviction that suffering is not inevitable and that change is not a threat. It is salvation. It is the cry of the worker demanding fair wages, the protester facing riot shields for the right to exist, the student calling for a future that isn't burning. It pushes against every gate kept closed by tradition, wealth, and fear. It is feminism breaking glass ceilings, civil rights marching through oppression, climate activism daring to defy billion-dollar industries. It believes the arc of history bends toward justice, but only if people grab it and pull. Progressivism does not worship the past. It interrogates it. It understands that tradition can be both anchor and shackle. It looks forward, not blindly, but bravely, knowing that justice evolves, that rights must expand, that power must be constantly questioned. It's messy, it's loud, it makes people uncomfortable, but it is discomfort that stirs a sleeping conscience. To its critics, progressivism is chaos disguised as compassion, but to those who carry it, it is hope armed with action. It fights not just for what is, but for what should be, and it will not be quiet, because silence has never saved anyone. Progressivism speaks, shouts, fights, and builds, because the future isn't something we wait for. It's something we create. Centrism. Centrism is the calm in the storm, or the silence in a room on fire, depending on who you ask. It is the belief that truth rarely lives in the extremes, that wisdom often lies between shouting opposites. At its core, centrism seeks balance between liberty and order, market and welfare, tradition and change. It trusts in pragmatism over ideology, dialogue over dogma, and compromise over conflict. It emerges in times of polarization, when the left and right seem more interested in destroying each other than solving anything. Centrism offers a different path, not of surrender, but of synthesis. It believes that society is not a battlefield, but a delicate machine that must be calibrated, not smashed. It urges caution when others rush, patience when others rage, and reason when others radicalize. Centrism values institutions, processes, rules. It respects them not because they are perfect, but because they prevent chaos. It seeks reform, not revolution. It asks not who's loudest, but what works. And in a world drowning in outrage and purity tests, centrism clings to nuance like a lifeline. But centrism walks a dangerous line. To some, it is integrity, an anchor in ideological storms. To others, it is cowardice, refusing to take a stand when justice demands clarity. It risks becoming apathy dressed as moderation, a quiet shrug in the face of suffering, a comfort zone for the privileged who can afford patience. Yet its defenders argue this: when both sides are screaming, someone must still be willing to listen. Someone must still believe in bridges, not barricades. And that belief, that the center still matters, is the quiet defiance of centrism. Not flashy, not loud, but holding steady while the world tears at its seams. Radical centrism. Radical centrism is the defiant middle finger to political extremes, the bold, disruptive belief that the center isn't weakness, but rebellion. It's not about indecision or playing it safe. It's about tearing down the rigid walls of left and right and forging a path that is pragmatic, principled, and brutally honest. At its core, Radical centrism is the refusal to be pulled into ideological loyalty. It asks, what works? What's fair? What moves us forward? Not what side are you on? It is the radical belief that complexity matters, that problems are not always red or blue, that truth doesn't wear a team jersey. Radical centrism is exhausting because it demands thought, not allegiance. It challenges dogma from both sides. It will call out corporate greed and bureaucratic waste. It will fight for social justice while demanding personal responsibility. It will defend free markets while insisting on safety nets. It is both and, not either or. But make no mistake, this is not neutrality. This is combat against lazy ideology, against broken systems glued together by party loyalty and tribal rage. Radical centrism says we can tax billionaires and support small businesses. We can fund police reform and protect public safety. We can fight climate change with innovation and regulation. We can be compassionate without being naive. To partisans, it looks like betrayal. To purists, it sounds like compromise. But to those who live in the real world, who see nuance, who crave solutions, who are tired of screaming matches that fix nothing, radical centrism feels like a lifeline. It doesn't want balance for balance's sake. It wants progress that actually works, and that, in today's polarized chaos, is a truly radical thing. Third way. The third way is the uneasy handshake between capitalism and compassion, a political tightrope strung between left and right, trying to offer modern solutions without old ideologies. At its core, the third way is a belief that we no longer have to choose between free markets and social justice, between enterprise and equity. It insists there's a middle path where economic dynamism can coexist with human dignity. It promises both prosperity and fairness, without revolution or regression. Born in an era when socialism was collapsing and unregulated capitalism was tearing open new wounds, the third way emerged with the language of pragmatism. It spoke of innovation, of modernization, of a smarter state, one that wouldn't smother markets, but would shape them. Welfare would still exist, but streamlined. Government would still serve, but more efficiently. Equality mattered, but growth had to come first. It was the politics of the real world, of technocrats and centrists who believed big dreams must bow to economic reality. It became the strategy of leaders who wanted to win in a changing world, who wore suits instead of raising fists, who quoted data instead of Marx. And for a while, it worked. It softened capitalism's sharpest edges, lifted some from poverty, and embraced globalization with open arms. But in its attempt to please all, the third way began to lose its soul. To critics, it became the politics of betrayal, hollow promises, corporate coziness, and sanitized rhetoric that forgot the working class. It tried to be everything, and in trying, it left many feeling unseen. Yet even now, in an age of renewed extremism, the third way lingers, whispering that maybe, just maybe, the answer isn't always found in burning it down or doubling down. Sometimes it says, progress is built, not shouted. Agrarianism is the heartbeat of the soil, a quiet but unyielding belief that the land is sacred, that virtue grows from honest labor, and that true freedom is rooted in self-sufficiency, not in stock markets or skyscrapers. It is not nostalgia. It is defiance against a world that measures success in speed, consumption, and disconnection. At its core, agrarianism is a call to return to what sustains us: the earth, the seasons, the simple dignity of cultivating life with your own hands. It sees the farmer not as a relic, but as a rebel, resisting the industrial sprawl, the corporate takeover of food, the mass alienation of modern life. Where cities pile people on top of each other, agrarianism spreads them out under the sky. Where economies digitize and abstract, agrarianism stays grounded, literally. It believes that community should be local, that food should be grown where it's eaten, that land should not be a commodity, but a covenant. In a world racing toward automation and artificiality, agrarianism whispers a dangerous question: what have we lost? It mourns the disappearance of craftsmanship, the erosion of rural life, the vanishing intimacy between people and place. It stands against the logic of endless growth, rejecting the idea that progress must come through detachment from nature. Critics call it backwards, romantic. But to those who live by it, agrarianism feels like truth, an anchor in the chaos, a rebellion built on rhythm, humility, and care. It doesn't crave empire, it craves enough. It doesn't worship power, it honors stewardship. And in an age of concrete and screens, agrarianism dares to say, the future may lie in what we left behind. Distributism. Distributism is the quiet revolt with calloused hands, a vision of society where power is spread like seeds, not hoarded like gold. It is the belief that neither the state nor massive corporations should control the economy, but that property, real, productive property, should be widely owned by ordinary people. At its core, distributism dreams of a world where families own the land they farm, the shops they run, the tools they use. A world of smallholders, artisans, and communities, not faceless megastructures and bureaucracies. Born as a response to both capitalism's greed and socialism's centralization, distributism walks a stubborn third path. It sees unchecked capitalism as a machine that devours lives in the name of profit, and sees socialism as one that replaces the market's master with the state's. It rejects both. It wants something rooted, local, human. It wants men and women to own their work, not rent their existence from landlords and bosses. Distributism isn't nostalgic, it's intentional. It believes that dignity comes from ownership, that freedom dies in dependency, and that economies should be built around families, not stock exchanges. It favors cooperatives over corporations, guilds over monopolies, and stewardship over speculation. It is deeply moral, often drawing from Catholic social teaching, echoing the sacred belief that every person has a right to the means of making a living. In a world of tech giants, billionaire overlords, and algorithmic control, distributism sounds like rebellion in slow motion. It whispers that the answer to dehumanization is not more regulation, it is rerouting, bringing ownership home, taking back the soil beneath your feet, because in that soil, it believes, lies the only kind of freedom worth having, the kind you can build with your own hands. Georgism. Georgism is the radical yet quietly elegant idea that the earth belongs to everyone, that while you have every right to own what you build, no one has the right to monopolize what was never theirs to begin with. It's named after Henry George, a 19th century thinker who asked a simple, explosive question: why should a few grow rich just by owning land, while others labor endlessly and own nothing? At its core, Georgism demands justice not through force, but through fairness, through one clear solution: tax the land, not the farmer's crop, not the worker's wage, not the inventor's creation, the land itself, its raw, natural value that increases not because of any individual's effort, but because of the community, the location, the public investment surrounding it. Georgism sees land as a gift, not a product, a resource meant to be shared, not hoarded, and when land becomes a speculative asset, a playground for landlords and tycoons, society fractures. Homelessness rises, rents skyrocket, the earth, once a common inheritance, is fenced off for profit. But Georgism doesn't preach destruction, it offers balance. Let people keep what they earn, but make them pay for what they take. A land value tax, simple, just, transformative, no loopholes, no punishment for productivity, only for privilege unearned. To many, Georgism is a quiet philosophy, but in truth, it is fire beneath the surface, because it reveals something few dare to say, that much of our suffering is built not on scarcity, but on theft, disguised as ownership, and until we reclaim the earth from those who claim it by title, freedom will always have a landlord. Guild Socialism. Guild socialism is the resurrection of craftsmanship in the age of industrial alienation, a vision where workers do not just labor, but govern, where industry is not owned by capital or controlled by the state, but by those who breathe life into it. At its core, guild socialism imagines a society where the economy is run by democratic associations of producers, guilds, not distant shareholders, not bureaucrats, but the workers themselves, bound not by wages but by purpose. It rises from the anguish of the assembly line, from the soul-numbing repetition that turns people into cogs. Guild socialism fights that dehumanization with a simple, radical idea. Work should be sacred, not sacred in theory, but in structure. It demands that those who build, who teach, who heal, who craft, have real control, not just over their labor, but over the systems in which their labor exists. It seeks to democratize industry at its core. In this world, each trade forms its own guild, a self-governing body responsible for production, training, ethics, and discipline. These guilds collaborate through federations, shaping policy and distribution as equals. The state doesn't vanish, it facilitates, but it does not dominate. Political and economic power are severed, ensuring that no single force can own both your vote and your livelihood. Guild socialism rejects both the cold logic of capitalism and the suffocating grip of centralized socialism. It speaks to the human need for meaning in work, for dignity in craft, for pride in creation. It does not want workers to seize the factory. It wants them to transform it into something alive, something theirs, because when labor is ruled by distant powers, it becomes slavery in disguise. But when workers govern themselves, labor becomes life again, and life, finally, becomes worth living. Transhumanism. Transhumanism is the audacious belief that humanity is not the end, but only the beginning. It is a declaration that our biology is a cage, not a destiny, that suffering, aging, weakness, even death itself, are not sacred facts of life, but technical problems waiting to be solved. At its core, transhumanism is the pursuit of transcendence, not through religion, but through reason, innovation, and the full, fearless harnessing of science to reshape what it means to be human. It dreams in code and steel, in neural links and gene edits, in prosthetics more powerful than limbs, minds enhanced by AI, lifespans stretched beyond comprehension. It sees wheelchairs becoming exoskeletons, blind eyes replaced with digital vision, diseases erased, not endured, and beyond all that, it whispers of something more, the evolution of consciousness itself, a future where intelligence is unlimited, where memory is eternal, where the boundary between mind and machine dissolves. To many, this is thrilling. To others, terrifying, because transhumanism doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't wait for comfort. It races ahead, unbothered by tradition, daring to play God with the flesh we were born in. It is not content with curing disease. It wants to end aging. Not content with aiding the disabled, it wants to augment the able. It believes the sacred must yield to the possible. Critics call it hubris, madness, a loss of humanity. But transhumanism sees that human is not a finish line. It's a launching point. And for those who believe, the future is not something to fear. It is something to build, with trembling hands, fearless minds, and eyes set not on heaven, but on the stars. Posthumanism. Posthumanism is the unsettling whisper that the human being, our body, our mind, our supremacy, is not the center of the universe anymore. It is the philosophy that stares deep into the mirror and asks, what if human is not the end, but a fragile moment on a longer, stranger road. At its core, posthumanism challenges the very boundaries of identity, agency, and existence, breaking down the walls between human and machine, mind and network, flesh and code. It rises in the shadow of rapid technological transformation, AI that learns, bodies enhanced by implants, consciousness being mapped, digitized, and even dreamed of beyond death. Posthumanism doesn't simply accept these changes. It embraces them, questions them, and then dares to go further. It deconstructs the arrogance of human exceptionalism, the belief that we stand above nature, animals, or artificial creations, and replaces it with humility, curiosity, and awe. In the posthuman world, the self becomes porous. Intelligence is no longer exclusively biological, emotion is no longer uniquely ours, and the body, once seen as a fixed boundary, becomes fluid, mergeable with metal, code, and synthetic skin. It is liberation to some, annihilation to others. For posthumanism, identity is no longer defined by species, but by consciousness, connection, and capability. It's not science fiction. It's a philosophical revolution already unfolding, and it asks us to prepare, not just technologically, but spiritually, for a future where the definition of us may no longer apply. Posthumanism doesn't fear this. It leans into it, because evolution never asked for permission, and the future will not wait for us to feel ready. Feminism. Feminism is the rebellion that refuses to die, the relentless, unyielding demand that women be seen, heard, and free. It is not a plea for kindness. It is a scream against centuries of silence. At its core, feminism is the belief that gender should not determine power, worth, or destiny. It is the fight to dismantle the invisible scaffolding that holds patriarchy in place, in homes, in offices, in courts, in culture, in the cracks of everyday life where inequality hides. It is born from the woman denied education, the girl told to shrink, smile, and obey, the mother working 2 jobs for half the pay, the survivor not believed, the voices mocked for being too emotional, too loud, too much. Feminism is their fire turned into fury. It is protest and poetry, legislation, and lived experience. It breaks chains and expectations. It asks not only for justice, but for transformation. Feminism is not about hating men. It is about loving freedom. It is the simple, radical truth that women are human beings, not symbols, not servants, not property, not objects to be marketed, managed, or manipulated. It challenges systems that call dominance natural and submission noble. It demands that women's bodies are not battlegrounds for laws, that ambition is not a masculine trait, that softness is not weakness, and rage is not a sin. To the threatened, feminism feels like invasion. To the awakened, it feels like breath. It does not ask politely. It does not wait. It rises, in waves, in marches, in whispers passed from mother to daughter. You are more. And in a world that profits from telling women otherwise, feminism remains a revolution with no intention of fading. Ecofeminism. Ecofeminism is a scream and a prayer, born at the crossroads where the wounds of women and the wounds of the earth bleed into one. It is the belief that the domination of nature and the oppression of women are not just parallel, they are intertwined, rooted in the same logic of exploitation, control, and silencing. At its core, ecofeminism refuses to separate environmental destruction from patriarchy. It sees the clear-cut forest in the same frame as the silenced voice. It hears the drilling and the gaslighting as echoes of the same violence. It rises in response to centuries of conquest, where men claimed dominion over land, over animals, over bodies, where nature was labeled wild, irrational, feminine, and thus something to be tamed, where women were branded emotional, chaotic, dangerous, and thus something to be ruled. Ecofeminism says this is no accident. The systems that extract, pollute, and destroy are the same ones that degrade, marginalize, and abuse. But ecofeminism is not just rage, it is rebirth. It envisions a world built on connection instead of conquest, cooperation instead of competition. It honors intuition, care, community, the sacredness of all life, not as weaknesses, but as the blueprint for survival. It is women planting trees in the face of bulldozers. It is mothers defending water like it's blood. It is the healing of earth through the healing of power. To ignore ecofeminism is to miss the pattern etched into centuries of suffering. To embrace it is to realize that saving the planet isn't just about science, it's about soul. Because the future will not be saved by domination, it will be saved by listening. And the earth, like every silenced woman, is done asking politely. Maternal feminism. Maternal feminism is power rooted in nurture. The belief that a woman's role as mother, caregiver, and moral center is not weakness, but strength. It is the conviction that women deserve influence in public life because of their unique role in shaping the private one. At its core, maternal feminism does not reject femininity, it elevates it. It argues that society cannot thrive when the voices of those who raise its future are kept at the margins. It rose from an era when women had no vote, no office, no recognized power, yet carried the weight of family, home, and morality on their backs. Rather than deny this role, maternal feminists wielded it as a weapon. They stepped into politics not as invaders of a man's world, but as protectors of humanity itself. Who better to care for the vulnerable, to legislate with compassion, to uplift the broken, than the ones who gave them life? Maternal feminism is not the feminism of rebellion. It is the feminism of redefinition. It transformed the image of the self-sacrificing mother into one of civic force. It fueled temperance movements, education reform, child labor laws, and social welfare, not by demanding equality through sameness, but by claiming moral responsibility as political right. Critics called it conformist, but it was revolutionary in disguise. It turned the patriarchal idea of woman's place into leverage, arguing that if women are responsible for the soul of the nation, they must have a voice in its laws. It didn't burn down the pedestal. It climbed on top of it and spoke, and in doing so, it carved a path where care became power and motherhood a reason to lead. Individualist feminism. Individualist feminism is the fierce flame of personal sovereignty, the unshakable belief that every woman is the master of her own life, her own body, her own mind. It rejects the idea that liberation must come through collective identity or imposed solidarity. At its core, individualist feminism declares freedom is not granted by movements, it is claimed by the individual. It is autonomy over approval, choice over consensus, empowerment without permission. Born from the tensions between state control and cultural expectation, individualist feminism turns inward, not in selfishness, but in self-possession. It doesn't ask what women as a group deserve. It asks, what does this woman want? What does she choose? Whether she seeks power in the boardroom or peace in solitude. Whether she shatters ceilings or builds her own house on her own terms. That is her revolution. That is her feminism. It is skeptical of victim narratives, wary of paternalistic policies that assume women need saving. It resents any ideology, left or right, that tells women who they should be, what they must believe, or how they must live to be real feminists. Individualist feminism is a sharp blade that cuts through conformity in all its forms. It embraces entrepreneurship, self-determination, and the radical act of saying no. No to systems that define, No to movements that demand allegiance. No to any force that claims to speak for her. To some, it's empowering. To others, dangerous. But to those who live it, individualist feminism is freedom unfiltered. It does not need validation. It does not wait for permission. It is not a collective chant. It is a single voice, rising unapologetically to say, I am mine. Intersectional feminism. Intersectional feminism is the fierce, necessary realization that not all women face the world the same way, that gender is only one part of the story, and oppression is not a single blade, but 1,000 cuts, each shaped by race, class, sexuality, disability, religion, and more. At its core, intersectional feminism is the demand that feminism be honest, that it listen harder, look deeper, and refuse to center only the voices that have always been heard. It was born not from theory, but from exhaustion, from black women told to wait their turn, from queer women told their love was a distraction, from immigrant women told their struggle didn't fit the narrative. Intersectional feminism is not division, it is inclusion. It says, you cannot fight for all women while ignoring the ones crushed by more than gender. It is a reckoning with privilege inside the movement itself. A call to check who speaks, who benefits, who gets erased. Intersectional feminism sees how poverty magnifies misogyny, how racism distorts justice, how ableism silences survivors. It sees how systems overlap, reinforce, and trap. And it refuses to let feminism be simplified into slogans that only liberate those already closest to power. This feminism is louder, messier, braver. It holds space for contradiction and complexity. It says there is no single woman's experience, no universal woman's struggle. It demands that we fight not just for equality, but for equity, not just for freedom, but for access, for safety, for dignity. To some, it sounds like too much, but to those who've been left out for too long, intersectional feminism is not extra, it is everything. It is the only kind of feminism that refuses to leave anyone behind. Masculinism. Masculinism is the raw, defiant answer to a world where some believe the male identity has been reduced to caricature, predator, privilege, or punchline. At its core, masculinism seeks to defend, restore, or reassert male identity, rights, and value in a culture it views as increasingly hostile or dismissive of masculinity. It rises from a sense of erosion, the belief that men are losing something, voice, purpose, respect, in the wake of cultural, legal, and psychological shifts. It is not a singular ideology, but a reaction against perceived bias in family courts, against the shaming of male emotion, against the social script that says strength is toxic, that ambition is oppressive, that manhood itself is outdated. Masculinism insists that masculinity is not broken, it is misunderstood, that boys raised to feel shame for their natural instincts become men filled with silence and resentment, that society cannot truly thrive while half of it is told to sit down, shut up, and apologize simply for being born male. Masculinism is not always kind. It can lash out, it can harden, but beneath the posture is often a quieter truth, a cry for belonging, for dignity, for acknowledgement. It asks, where do men go when they break? Who listens when they're lost? Who protects them when they're no longer protectors? To some, masculinism is backlash. To others, it is balance. But at its heart is the aching question of identity, of how to be a man in a world where the definition keeps shifting, shrinking, or disappearing altogether. And in that confusion, masculinism does not whisper. It pushes back. It demands to be seen. It demands to matter. Anti-feminism. Anti-feminism is the backlash dressed in certainty, a rejection of the feminist movement and its claim that gender equality is still a fight worth having. It is the conviction that feminism has gone too far, that women are no longer oppressed, and that the real threat now is not patriarchy, but feminism itself. At its core, anti-feminism is rooted in a belief that the pursuit of equality has upended natural order, eroded traditional values, and villainized masculinity. It speaks from pulpits, podcasts, parliaments. It says men are under attack, that masculinity is being dismantled, that women have been liberated not into freedom, but into isolation, bitterness, and endless competition. It longs for a return to structure, where men lead, women nurture, and everyone knows their place. Anti-feminism sees gender roles not as cages, but as anchors. It does not question power dynamics. It defends them. To some, anti-feminism is rebellion against political correctness, a cry for simplicity in a world of shifting identities and blurred expectations. To others, it is a weapon wielded by those threatened by change, those who mistake equality for loss, who confuse critique with hatred, who cannot accept that rights must stretch to include all. But beneath the rhetoric is often fear of irrelevance, of displacement, of a world where control is shared and voices once silenced now speak loudly. Anti-feminism does not seek conversation. It seeks rollback. It mourns a version of society where silence was mistaken for peace. And while it claims to protect, to restore, to defend, what it often defends is a past built on imbalance, a past where one gender's comfort came at the cost of another's voice, and feminism, for all its flaws, refuses to let that silence return. Identity politics. Identity politics is the thunder of a voice, long silenced, finally saying, "I am here, and I will not be erased." It is the unapologetic belief that personal identity, race, gender, sexuality, religion, ability, is not a distraction from politics, but its very foundation. At its core, identity politics insists that who you are shapes how you are treated, and that ignoring this truth is not neutrality, it's complicity. It was born from the margins, from the wounds of systemic erasure. It rose from black voices crushed beneath centuries of racism, from queer communities buried by silence, from women dismissed, violated, and underestimated. Identity politics shatters the myth that justice can be blind, because when the system sees color, gender, or orientation as targets, pretending not to see them at all is just another form of violence. It demands recognition, not as charity, but as justice. It calls for policies that reflect lived experience, for spaces where power isn't just shared, but shifted. It gives the microphone to those who've been talked over, and it burns down the old narrative that one story fits all. But identity politics also carries heat. Critics call it divisive, tribal, corrosive to unity. They say it reduces people to labels, that it fractures solidarity. Yet to its defenders, it's not division, it's visibility. Not victimhood, it's truth. Because when your very identity has been used against you, reclaiming it becomes an act of power. This is not just politics, it's survival wrapped in assertion. It's not just about inclusion, it's about rewriting the rules. And it does not ask permission to speak. It insists on being heard, because identity, once denied, becomes the very fuel of revolution. Multiculturalism. Multiculturalism is the belief that difference is not danger, it's strength. That a society is richer, not weaker, when many cultures live within it, speak through it, and shape it. At its core, multiculturalism is a stand against fear, against uniformity, against the pressure to erase what makes us who we are in order to belong. It is the idea that diversity doesn't need to be tolerated. It should be celebrated. It lives in the rhythm of many languages spoken on the same street, in mosques beside cathedrals, in food that crosses oceans and finds a home on your plate. It breathes in classrooms where names come from every continent and in cities where no one story defines the whole. Multiculturalism does not ask people to assimilate. It invites them to bring their culture to the table and be heard, seen, honored. But it is not without tension. It challenges the myth of a single national identity. It disrupts the comfort of sameness. It forces hard questions. Who gets to define a country? Who is considered truly from here? Critics call it naive, a breeding ground for fragmentation, a threat to cohesion. But to those who've been told they must erase their accent, their dress, their God, their story just to belong, multiculturalism is not a policy. It's survival. It dares to say a nation can be many things at once. That difference is not a crack in the foundation, it is the foundation. And in a world still obsessed with borders, tribes, and walls, multiculturalism plants its flag in the opposite direction, toward empathy, coexistence, and the radical belief that identity does not need to be singular to be whole. Separatism. Separatism is the raw, pulsing refusal to belong to a system that has betrayed, erased, or oppressed. It is not diplomacy, it's departure. At its core, separatism is the belief that coexistence has failed, that shared institutions have become cages, and that the only path to dignity, safety, or sovereignty is through withdrawal. It does not plead for reform, it demands escape. It breaks ties, redraws borders, and carves out space where a people can finally breathe without permission. It rises from deep wounds, colonial rule, cultural erasure, broken treaties, systemic violence. It is the battle cry of indigenous nations, of ethnic minorities, of gendered bodies pushed to the edges of every room. It is the voice that says, "We have tried to be heard, we have tried to belong, and we have bled for it. Now we choose separation." Separatism doesn't always mean building new nations. Sometimes it's psychological. Sometimes it's spiritual. Sometimes it's a community within a community where shared trauma becomes shared purpose. It is women forming their own movements when patriarchy infects the left. It is Black communities demanding self-determination after centuries of systemic theft. It is nations within nations aching to be free. But separatism is not without risk. It can harden into walls, into purism, into exile by choice. It can breed isolation and resentment. Yet for those who turn to it, the alternative is worse: continued erasure, forced assimilation, a slow death under the weight of another's rules. Separatism is not born from hate, it is born from survival. And sometimes the most radical act of resistance isn't confrontation, it's walking away and building something that cannot be taken. Not again. Not ever. Communitarianism. Communitarianism is the quiet rebellion against isolation, the belief that the individual does not exist in a vacuum and that true freedom cannot flourish without responsibility to one another. It is a philosophy rooted in connection, in the idea that a society thrives not through competition alone, but through shared values, mutual obligation, and the strength of community. At its core, communitarianism insists that we are not just me, we are we. It pushes back against radical individualism, the idea that self-interest is the highest good, that liberty means detachment, and that society should exist merely to protect personal rights. Communitarianism doesn't reject freedom, but it reframes it. Freedom with no duty, no relationship, no anchor, becomes emptiness. What is liberty, it asks, if your neighbor is starving, if your streets are broken, if your children inherit a society of strangers? It calls for balance between rights and responsibilities, between self and society. It defends tradition not out of fear of change, but out of reverence for meaning. It believes that moral values cannot be outsourced to laws or left to market forces, that the health of a nation is measured not just by its economy, but by how connected its people are. to each other, to their place, to something greater than themselves. Critics call it conservative. Others say it limits freedom. But to those who carry it, communitarianism is a compass pointing away from apathy. In a world of growing loneliness, where people scroll but don't speak, where community has been replaced by consumerism, communitarianism feels like a return to something we forgot we needed: belonging, responsibility, the sacred strength of us. Republicanism. Republicanism is the fierce declaration that power must never be inherited, that no crown, no bloodline, no divine right should ever eclipse the will of the people. It is the belief that a just society can only exist when its leaders serve, not rule, and when sovereignty lives not in a throne, but in the collective hands of its citizens. At its core, republicanism is the heartbeat of self-governance, the idea that liberty demands vigilance and that freedom dies when power settles unchecked. It rose from rebellion, from torches lit in the night, from declarations scrawled in ink and blood, from empires that silenced voices and monarchs who treated nations like playthings. Republicanism shattered that legacy with one radical promise: you are not subjects, you are citizens, and with citizenship comes both freedom and responsibility. Republicanism reveres institutions, but only when they are accountable. It champions law, but only when it is equal. It builds constitutions like bulwarks against tyranny, and it places the people, not a person, at the center of its moral universe. It fears the concentration of power, whether in kings, dictators, or demagogues, and it answers that fear with checks, balances, elections, and debate. But republicanism is not passive. It demands participation. It requires a citizenry that does more than consume or complain. It calls for action, for education, for the courage to speak truth to power, even when it's your own side in control. To betray republicanism is to forget how fragile freedom really is. To uphold it is to remember that liberty is not a gift. It is a fire that must be guarded, fed, and passed down. And once it is yours, you don't kneel, you stand, because no one rules where the people are sovereign. Federalism. Federalism is power divided with purpose, the belief that no single authority should hold everything, and that freedom is preserved when governance is shared, layered, and localized. At its core, federalism is the architecture of balance between national unity and regional autonomy, between centralized strength and local voice. It doesn't demand that every town look the same. It insists that different voices, different needs, and different histories be allowed to coexist within one political body. It was born from a deep fear of tyranny, not only from monarchs, but from the possibility that even a democratic government, if too concentrated, could become deaf to its people. Federalism answers that fear by scattering power. States, provinces, cantons, they all become sovereign within their own spheres, with the ability to govern, legislate, and lead in a way that reflects their unique realities. One nation, many governments. One constitution, many interpretations. But federalism is not tidy. It creates friction. Laws clash. Rights vary. Progress speeds in some places and stalls in others. Yet that friction is not failure. It is the price of pluralism. It allows rural voices to differ from urban ones, regional cultures to shape local policy, and experiments in governance to rise without dragging down the entire country. Critics say it breeds inequality, inefficiency, division. But to believers, federalism is not a flaw, it's a safeguard, a pressure valve, a structure that prevents one-size-fits-all rule from crushing the complexity of human society. In a world where power so often reaches too far, federalism dares to hold it back, to break it into pieces, and to trust the people with more than one center of control: confederalism. Confederalism is power turned upside down, a structure where the center does not command, but obeys. It is the radical belief that true democracy begins from the bottom, not from above. At its core, confederalism envisions a political system in which autonomous communities voluntarily unite for mutual benefit, while fiercely guarding their independence. It is unity without domination, cooperation without conquest. It rises from the ruins of centralized failure, from empires that collapsed under their own weight, from governments that promised representation but delivered remote control. Confederalism says, let each region, each city, each commune govern itself, and then choose to link arms with others. The Confederation exists to coordinate, not to command. Its authority is granted, not assumed. Confederalism breathes through assemblies, through federated councils, through local voices rising into collective decisions. It distrusts top-down rule and sees imposed uniformity as a quiet violence. It asks, why should distant capitals make decisions for lives they do not live? It believes diversity is not a threat, but a strength, and that politics should reflect the rhythms of local life, not the obsessions of elites. To some, it feels inefficient. To others, it is the only system that respects human dignity. It has inspired indigenous governance, revolutionary movements, and ecological visions of decentralization. It does not promise simplicity. It promises shared power, something far more dangerous to tyrants. Confederalism is not a relic. It is a resistance to the gravitational pull of empire. It is what happens when people say, we will work together, but never again bow. Because freedom in confederalism is not just a right, it's the foundation, and it flows outward, not inward from the people, always. Direct democracy. Direct democracy is the raw, untamed voice of the people, the belief that citizens should not just choose their rulers, but be the rulers, that decisions affecting the many should not be filtered through elites, parties, or bureaucracies, but made directly by the hands of those who live with their consequences. At its core, direct democracy is trust, radical, unapologetic trust in ordinary people to govern themselves. It cuts through the performance of politics. No career politicians, no backroom deals, no carefully crafted speeches masking self-interest, just questions and answers, proposals and votes. Town square governance for a modern age. It is the referendum, the popular initiative, the public assembly. It is the crowd that refuses to be spectators any longer. Direct democracy is exhilarating. It gives power not every 4 years, but every day. It makes citizenship a constant act, not a checkbox. It allows people to shape budgets, pass laws, reject policies, and remake their world in real time. It feels pure, because it is. There are no middlemen, no spokespeople, only the people and their will. But its beauty is also its burden. It demands attention, education, participation. It risks chaos, manipulation, fatigue. It can empower justice or enshrine cruelty, because when everyone decides, the outcome reflects not just wisdom, but fear, hope, anger, and bias. Direct democracy is not always kind, but it is always honest. To its defenders, it is the truest form of liberty. To its critics, a dangerous gamble. But to those who have been unheard, unseen, unrepresented, direct democracy feels like a revolution made permanent. A seat at the table, not as a guest, but as the host. Participatory democracy. Participatory democracy is the unfiltered voice of the people, loud, messy, insistent. It is the belief that true democracy cannot be reduced to ballots every few years or representatives speaking on behalf of strangers. At its core, participatory democracy demands that citizens don't just vote, they govern. that decisions shaping lives must be made by those who live them, not passed down from podiums wrapped in polite detachment. It rises in opposition to apathy, to systems where the elite debate while communities rot, where polished officials make choices far removed from the ground they affect. Participatory democracy says, show up, speak out, stay involved. It builds town halls instead of towers, councils instead of congresses, and demands that democracy be a daily act, not a seasonal performance. It thrives on engagement, in neighborhoods deciding how to spend their own budgets, in students shaping their schools, in workers organizing their workplaces. It is driven not by faith in leaders, but by faith in each other. It doesn't shy away from complexity. It embraces it, because it knows that people, when given real power, rise to the challenge, not perfectly, but passionately. To critics, it's chaos, too slow, too naive, but to its defenders, that chaos is the sound of power finally becoming shared, of voices long ignored speaking truths long buried. It's what democracy feels like when it's real, imperfect, alive, untamed. Participatory democracy is not content with representation. It demands presence, not permission, participation. It is a call not just to be heard, but to shape the world with your own hands. Because freedom isn't just choosing your rulers, it's refusing to be ruled at all. Deliberative democracy. Deliberative democracy is democracy slowed down, not to weaken it, but to deepen it. It is the radical belief that true freedom isn't just the right to vote, but the right to be heard, to listen, to reason together in good faith before a single law is passed or a single power granted. At its core, deliberative democracy demands more than opinion. It demands understanding. It sees citizens not as customers in a political marketplace, but as moral agents capable of shaping a shared future through dialogue, not division. It trusts that democracy is not a moment, it is a process, a messy, vulnerable, powerful process, one where people of different races, classes, beliefs, and fears sit face to face, not to win, but to learn, not to shout, but to build. It's what happens when town halls become sacred spaces, when citizens' assemblies rewrite constitutions, when disagreement is not a threat, but a tool. Deliberative democracy is not loud. It is not quick. It does not dance for the cameras, but it is strong, because it moves beneath the surface, quietly weaving legitimacy into decisions. It asks people not just what they want, but why. It dares to believe that conversation, when honest and inclusive, can outmatch propaganda, polarization, and performance. Critics call it naive, too slow, too idealistic for a world addicted to outrage. But those who've seen it, truly seen it, know its power, because once people feel not just consulted, but respected, something shifts. Deliberative democracy doesn't promise perfection, but it offers something more precious, decisions made not in the heat of anger, but in the light of shared humanity. Representative democracy. Representative democracy is the bridge between the will of the many and the machinery of governance. It is the belief that while not everyone can sit in the halls of power, their voices can and must be carried there by those chosen to speak on their behalf. At its core, representative democracy is a pact. The people lend authority to their elected leaders, and in return, those leaders must answer to them. It is power filtered through consent, rule not by birth, force, or wealth, but by trust. It rises from the wreckage of monarchy, tyranny, and mob rule. It says that order and liberty do not have to be enemies, that we can balance the chaos of mass participation with the structure of deliberation, that citizens can live their lives while still shaping the fate of nations, through the vote, through advocacy, through oversight. In a representative democracy, the ballot becomes sacred. It is the quiet thunder of change. It chooses lawmakers, holds them accountable, and, when needed, removes them. It empowers ordinary people to challenge giants, not with weapons, but with ink and paper. It makes politics accessible without demanding total immersion, but that strength is also its vulnerability. Because when representatives forget who they serve, when elections become rituals instead of reckonings, when voices go unheard for too long, representative democracy begins to rot. It becomes theater, a mask for elite control, and the people feel it. They withdraw, they doubt, they burn with questions. Do they really speak for me? Do they even hear me anymore? Yet its promise still endures. Representative democracy is not perfect. It's a constant negotiation, but in its best moments, it turns strangers into citizens and opinion into law. It is hope made procedural, and when it works, it reminds the powerful exactly where their power came from.